The year was 1895, and the age of sail was drawing to a close. Steam-powered vessels had begun to dominate the seas, rendering the great clipper ships obsolete. Yet on a spring morning in April, as Boston Harbor awakened to the sounds of industry and commerce, one man prepared to embark on a voyage that would become legendary, not because it represented the future, but because it celebrated the dying art of traditional seamanship. His name was Joshua Slocum, and his vessel was the Spray, a modest sloop that would carry him into history as the first person to sail single-handedly around the world. But this is more than simply a tale of nautical achievement. This is a story about human determination, about an aging sea captain who refused to accept that his time had passed, and about a journey that would test every skill, every ounce of courage, and every fiber of resilience in one man's weathered body. It's a story about solitude and self-reliance, about the raw beauty and terrifying power of the world's oceans, and about what happens when a man who has lived his entire life on the water decides to take on the ultimate maritime challenge. The story of Joshua Slocum and the Spray begins long before that April morning in Boston. It begins on the windswept shores of Nova Scotia, where a boy first felt the call of the sea. It winds through decades of commercial sailing, through triumphs and tragedies, through the building and losing of ships, through marriage and family, through prosperity and poverty. And it culminates in one of the most remarkable voyages in maritime history, a journey of more than 46,000 miles, spanning 3 years, across waters both calm and tempestuous, through encounters both wonderful and terrifying. What makes this story particularly compelling is that Slocum was not a young man when he undertook this journey. He was 51 years old when he departed Boston, an age when most sailors of his era had long since retired to a chair by the fire. His body bore the scars and wear of a lifetime at sea. His hands were calloused from years of handling rope and canvas. His eyes had gazed upon every ocean on earth. Yet within him burned an unquenchable spirit, a refusal to fade quietly into obscurity, and a desire to prove that the old ways, the ways of wind and sail, still had their place in a rapidly modernizing world. To understand this journey, we must first understand the man who undertook it. Joshua Slocum was born on February 20, 1844, in the rural community of Mount Hanley, Nova Scotia. This was a place where the land met the sea, where the Bay of Fundy's massive tides carved dramatic shorelines, and where nearly every family had at least one member who made their living from the ocean. Young Joshua was the fifth of 11 children born to John Slocum and Sarah Jane Southern. The family name would later be changed to Slocum, though the reasons for this alteration remained somewhat murky. The Slocum family history was itself a maritime tale. Joshua's ancestors had come to Nova Scotia as part of the Loyalist migration following the American War of Independence. His forefather, known as John the Exile, had been a Quaker who opposed the Revolutionary War and subsequently fled to British-controlled Nova Scotia, where the family was granted 500 acres of farmland in Annapolis County. This inheritance of loyalty to traditional values, of standing firm in one's convictions even when they run counter to prevailing winds, would manifest itself generations later in Joshua himself. The Slocum farmhouse in Mount Hanley sat within sight of the Bay of Fundy, the remarkable body of water famous for having the highest tides in the world. Young Joshua attended the local schoolhouse, a modest building that still stands today as a museum, where he learned to read and write. But his true education came from the sea itself. From an early age, he would venture down to the small ports along the bay, places like Port George and Cottage Cove, where he watched coastal schooners loading and unloading their cargoes, where he listened to sailors tell tales of distant ports and wild storms, where the smell of salt air and tar and fish filled his nostrils and stirred something deep within his soul. When Joshua was 8 years old, his family moved from Mount Hanley to Briar Island, located at the mouth of the Bay of Fundy. This move brought the family even closer to the maritime world. Briar Island was a remote and rugged place, constantly buffeted by wind and waves, where the lighthouse at Southwest Point, tended by Joshua's maternal grandfather, stood as a beacon against the darkness. Here, Joshua's father, John Slocum, attempted to establish a business making leather boots for local fishermen. It was hard, demanding work, carried out in a small workshop filled with the pungent odors of leather and dyes. John Slocum was, by all accounts, a stern and demanding man, a strict disciplinarian who expected much from his many children. Young Joshua was pressed into service in his father's shop, but the boy found the work stifling. The smell of shoe leather could not compete with the scent of salt air. The cramped confines of the workshop could not compare to the endless horizon visible from Briar Island's rocky shores. While his hands worked with leather and awls, his mind and heart wandered to the sea, to those vessels he watched passing by the island, to thoughts of adventure and distant lands. The household was increasingly chaotic as well. 11 children created a constant din of activity, and resources were stretched thin. Joshua's mother, Sarah Jane, did her best to maintain order and provide warmth amidst the challenges, but the demands were overwhelming. Young Joshua made several attempts to run away from home, each time drawn irresistibly toward the sea. Finally, at the age of 14, he succeeded. He hired on as a cabin boy and cook aboard a fishing schooner, though this first adventure was short-lived, and he soon returned home. But the seed had been planted, and it would soon sprout. In 1860, tragedy struck the Slocum household. Sarah Jane gave birth to her 11th child, but the ordeal proved too much for her weakened body. She died shortly after childbirth, leaving John Slocum with 11 children to raise. For 16-year-old Joshua, the loss of his kind and gentle mother removed one of the few threads still binding him to shore. That year, he and a friend left home for good. They made their way to Halifax, where they signed aboard a merchant ship bound for Dublin, Ireland, as ordinary seamen. This was Joshua Slocum's true beginning, the moment when he committed himself fully to the life he had long dreamed of. The voyage to Dublin was a revelation. Despite the hard work, the primitive conditions, and the often brutal discipline aboard merchant vessels of that era, Joshua felt he had found his calling. The motion of the ship beneath his feet, the snap of canvas filling with wind, the complexity of rigging and navigation, the camaraderie of the crew, all of it spoke to something fundamental within him. From Dublin, young Slocum crossed to Liverpool, where he joined the crew of the British merchant ship Tangier as an ordinary seaman, bound for China. Over the next 2 years, he received an intensive education in the ways of the sea. He rounded Cape Horn twice, experiencing firsthand the legendary terrors of that notorious passage. He visited Batavia in the Dutch East Indies, the Maluku Islands with their legendary spice trade, Manila, Hong Kong, Saigon, and Singapore. He sailed to San Francisco and back. Through all of this, while performing the demanding physical labor required of a common seaman, he studied. He pored over navigation manuals by lamplight in the forecastle. He observed the officers at work, learning the intricacies of celestial navigation and ship handling. He took notes, asked questions, and absorbed knowledge like a sponge. His dedication bore fruit. At the remarkably young age of 18, Joshua Slocum passed the Board of Trade examination and became a fully qualified second mate. This was no small achievement. The Board of Trade examinations were rigorous, requiring extensive knowledge of navigation, seamanship, ship construction, maritime law, and more. Many sailors spent years preparing for these exams and failed multiple times. That Slocum passed so young spoke volumes about his intelligence, his dedication, and his natural aptitude for seamanship. From second mate, Slocum rapidly advanced. Within a few years, he had progressed to chief mate, the second-in-command aboard large merchant vessels carrying cargo between the British Isles and San Francisco. These were not easy positions. A chief mate bore tremendous responsibility, managing the crew, overseeing cargo operations, standing watch, and serving as the captain's right hand in all matters. The work was demanding, the hours long, and the consequences of mistakes potentially catastrophic. Yet Slocum proved himself capable, earning the respect of captains and crew alike. In 1865, at the age of 21, Slocum settled in San Francisco and became an American citizen. This was a significant decision, representing a formal break with his British colonial past and an embrace of the rough, vital, expanding nation that was America. San Francisco in the 1860s was a boom town, still riding the after-effects of the gold rush, a place where fortunes could be made or lost in an instant, where every race and nationality on Earth seemed to converge, where ships from every ocean crowded the waterfront. For a time, Slocum left the open ocean to try his hand at other maritime pursuits. He went salmon fishing in the waters of the Pacific Northwest. He engaged in fur trading in the Oregon Territory, bartering with native peoples for pelts that could be sold for profit in San Francisco's markets. These experiences gave him a broader understanding of the maritime world and its commercial possibilities. But the call of deep-water sailing proved too strong. He returned to sea as a pilot on a schooner running coastal trade between San Francisco and Seattle. Then, in 1869, at the age of 25, Joshua Slocum achieved what had been his ambition since he first went to sea. He received his first command. He was made master of the bark Washington, tasked with sailing her from San Francisco to Australia and then to Alaska before returning home. To be given command of a vessel at 25 was remarkable. Most captains were considerably older, having spent decades working their way up through the ranks. But Slocum's skill, knowledge, and leadership abilities had impressed the vessel's owners, and they entrusted their ship and cargo to this relatively young man. The voyage of the Washington would prove significant in more ways than one. When Slocum brought his vessel into Sydney Harbour in January of 1871, he had no way of knowing that this port call would change his life. In Sydney, he met Virginia Albertina Walker, a young American woman whose family had migrated from New York to California during the gold rush and had subsequently moved to Australia. Virginia was intelligent, strong-willed, and adventurous, qualities that would prove essential, for Joshua Slocum was not a man who could remain ashore for long. Their courtship was brief. On January 31, 1871, just weeks after meeting, Joshua and Virginia were married. The very next day, February 1st, the Washington departed Sydney with Virginia aboard. This was not unusual for the era. Captains' wives frequently accompanied their husbands on long voyages, and Virginia would prove to be an enthusiastic and capable sailor. Over the following 13 years, as Joshua commanded a succession of vessels, Virginia sailed with him, and together they had 7 children, all born either at sea or in foreign ports. 4 of these children, Victor, Benjamin Aymar, James Garfield, and Jesse, survived to adulthood. Life at sea with a family was far from easy. The quarters aboard even large merchant vessels were cramped and primitive by modern standards. Privacy was virtually non-existent. Storms and rough seas could make even simple tasks like cooking or changing a baby's diaper extraordinarily difficult. Disease was a constant threat in ports throughout Asia and the Pacific. Yet Virginia embraced this life with remarkable fortitude. She learned seamanship herself, becoming skilled enough to stand watch and help with navigation. She educated the children aboard ship, turning the captain's cabin into a schoolroom. She created a home in the most unlikely of places, on the constantly moving, creaking, windswept deck of a sailing ship. Joshua's career as a ship's master flourished during these years. Between 1869 and 1889, he commanded 8 different vessels, progressing from the relatively small Washington to increasingly larger and more prestigious ships. His reputation as a skilled and reliable captain grew. Ship owners trusted him with valuable cargoes. Crews, despite his stern discipline, generally respected his seamanship and fairness. He was building both a career and a modest fortune. The family sailed from port to port, from continent to continent. They carried wool from Australia, grain from California, manufactured goods from Europe to Asia, and tea from China to American markets. They navigated through typhoons in the China Seas, weathered gales off Cape Horn, crossed the doldrums at the equator where windless calms could trap a sailing ship for weeks, and experienced the exhilaration of running before steady trade winds with every sail set and the ship making 12 knots or more. The children grew up knowing no other life, learning navigation and seamanship alongside their letters and numbers, experiencing a cosmopolitan education that few land-bound children could match. But the maritime life, for all its romance and adventure, was also filled with hardship and danger. Slocum experienced his share of both. In Alaska, the Washington was wrecked when she dragged anchor during a gale, ran ashore, and broke up on the rocks. Yet Slocum, at considerable risk to himself, managed to save his wife, crew, and much of the cargo, bringing everyone safely back to port in the ship's open boats. This feat of seamanship and leadership impressed the owners of the shipping company so much that they immediately gave him command of another, larger vessel, the Constitution. Each successive command brought new challenges. The merchant shipping business was competitive and often brutal. Captains were expected to drive their ships hard, to make fast passages, to squeeze maximum profit from every voyage. Discipline aboard ship could be harsh. Mutinies, while not common, were a real danger on long voyages far from any legal authority. Slocum faced his share of crew troubles, dealing with troublemakers with a firm hand that occasionally led to legal difficulties. In 1874, while in the Philippines, Slocum was commissioned by a British architect to organize native workers and build a 150-ton steamer in a shipyard at Subic Bay. This was a major undertaking, requiring not just maritime knowledge but also organizational and diplomatic skills. As partial payment for this work, Slocum received a 90-ton schooner named Pato, Spanish for duck. This was the first vessel he could call truly his own, and it afforded him a new kind of freedom. He was no longer working for others' wages but was now a ship owner himself, an independent operator who could choose his own cargoes and routes. Slocum used the Pato as a general freight carrier along the west coast of North America and on runs between San Francisco and Hawaii. During this period, he also fulfilled a long-held ambition to become a writer. He became a temporary correspondent for the San Francisco Bee, filing reports from various ports and recording his observations of the maritime world. This writing experience would later serve him well, though he could not have known it at the time. The family eventually sold the Pato in Honolulu and returned to San Francisco, where they purchased the Amethyst. After working this vessel for several years, they moved on to the Northern Light II, a large and impressive clipper 233 feet in length with a beam of 44 feet. This ship could carry 2,000 tons of cargo on 3 decks. Slocum called it "my best command," and indeed, it represented the pinnacle of his career as a merchant captain. But the Northern Light II also brought troubles. The ship was plagued by mutinies and mechanical problems. Under legally troubling circumstances involving his alleged treatment of a mutinous crew member, Slocum was forced to sell his share in the vessel in 1883. The family's next ship was the 326-ton Aquidneck, and it was aboard this vessel that tragedy struck. In 1884, while the ship was docked in Buenos Aires, Virginia became ill. Despite Joshua's best efforts and what medical care could be obtained in that port, she died. For Joshua Slocum, who had shared 13 years of maritime adventure with Virginia, who had watched her raise their children in the most challenging of circumstances, who had come to rely on her strength and companionship, this loss was devastating. The Aquidneck sailed back to Massachusetts, and Joshua left 3 of his younger children, Benjamin, Imar, Jesse, and Garfield, in the care of his sisters. His oldest son, Victor, who was now a young man, continued aboard as first mate. In 1886, at the age of 42, Slocum married again. His new wife was his 24-year-old cousin, Henrietta Hetties Elliott. The significant age difference was not uncommon for the era, especially for a widower with children. Henrietta agreed to join Joshua aboard the Aquidneck, and the family, now including Victor, Garfield, Hetty, and Joshua, once again set sail, this time bound for Montevideo, Uruguay. For Henrietta, who had not grown up on ships as Virginia had, life at sea proved far more difficult. Just days into her first voyage, the Aquidneck sailed through a hurricane. The experience was terrifying: mountainous seas, howling winds, the ship rolling and pitching wildly, water flooding over the deck. This was Henrietta's introduction to the life she had married into, and it set the tone for what would follow. That first year, the crew contracted cholera, and the ship was quarantined for 6 months, trapped in port, unable to trade or move, with disease ravaging the crew. Later, Slocum was forced to defend his ship from pirates. In the confrontation, he shot and killed one of the attackers. He was subsequently tried for murder but acquitted. Next, the Aquidneck became infected with smallpox, a terrifying disease that could devastate a ship's crew in close quarters. 3 crew members died before the outbreak was contained. Disinfecting the ship was an expensive and time-consuming process. Then, near the end of 1887, disaster struck. The Aquidneck was wrecked on the coast of southern Brazil. The ship, which had been Joshua's livelihood and home, was destroyed. The family found themselves stranded in a foreign country with limited resources and no means of escape. But Joshua Slocum was nothing if not resourceful. Stranded in Brazil with his wife and sons, he decided to build a boat that could carry them home. Using local materials, salvaged pieces from the wrecked Aquidneck, and with the help of local workers, he constructed a 35-foot vessel of unusual design, half Cape and dory, half Japanese sampan, rigged as a junk. The boat was launched on May 13, 1888, the very day that slavery was abolished in Brazil. In recognition of this historic event, Slocum named his creation the Liberdade, Portuguese for freedom. What followed was an extraordinary voyage. With his 15-year-old son Victor serving as mate, Joshua sailed the Liberdade from Brazil to the United States, a distance of 5,500 miles covered in 55 days. This was not a casual coastal cruise but an open ocean passage in a small, homemade boat. They endured storms, navigated without modern instruments, and ultimately made landfall at Cape Roman, South Carolina. From there, they continued through inland waterways to Washington, D.C. for the winter and finally reached Boston in 1889. This voyage demonstrated Slocum's remarkable seamanship and resourcefulness, but it also marked the end of an era. Henrietta never sailed with the family again after this ordeal, and Slocum published an account of the adventure in a book titled Voyage of the Liberdade in 1890. Now in his mid-40s, Joshua Slocum found himself at a crossroads. The age of commercial sailing ships was ending. Steamships were taking over the world's trade routes, and there were fewer and fewer opportunities for skilled sailing captains. Slocum tried to find new opportunities. In the winter of 1893 through 94, he undertook what he described as the hardest voyage I have ever made, without any exception at all. He was hired to deliver a steam-powered torpedo boat called the Destroyer from the east coast of the United States to Brazil. This vessel was an experimental design by John Erickson, intended for harbor and coastal defense. The voyage was a nightmare from the start. The Destroyer began taking on water almost immediately after leaving New Jersey. For weeks, Slocum and a small crew fought to keep the vessel afloat, pumping and bailing constantly, weathering fierce storms, dealing with mechanical failures. They burned furniture and even pork fat to keep the boilers lit. Several times, it seemed certain the vessel would sink. But through skill and sheer stubbornness, Slocum nursed the Destroyer to Brazil, arriving in Pernambuco in January of 1894. Once there, however, the Brazilian Navy seized the vessel, and an incompetent alternative crew promptly grounded it on rocks, holing and ultimately abandoning it. The whole affair left Slocum bitter and frustrated. By the mid-1890s, Joshua Slocum was facing an uncertain future. He was in his early 50s, an age when many men were thinking about retirement. He had spent nearly 4 decades at sea, had commanded numerous vessels, had sailed on every ocean on Earth, but he had little to show for it financially. The world he had known, the world of great sailing ships and skilled captains who could navigate by the stars, was rapidly disappearing. Steam and steel were replacing wind and canvas. The romantic age of sail was giving way to industrial efficiency. It was at this low point, when many men might have given up and accepted a quiet retirement, that Joshua Slocum conceived of an idea that would define his legacy. If the age of sail was ending, why not celebrate it with one final, grand adventure? Why not prove that the old skills, the old ships, the old ways, still had value? And what greater adventure could there be than to sail single-handedly around the world, a feat that had never been accomplished before? The idea was audacious, perhaps even mad. Solo circumnavigation would require covering roughly 40,000 miles or more, crossing every major ocean, weathering storms, navigating treacherous waters, and surviving months of solitude. Most sailors considered such a voyage impossible for a single individual. Even with a full crew, circumnavigation was a major undertaking. To attempt it alone seemed like a recipe for disaster. But Slocum was not deterred. He had spent his entire life on the water. He understood ships and the sea as few men did. He possessed the navigation skills necessary for such a journey. He was tough, resourceful, and experienced in handling emergencies. And perhaps most importantly, he had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. If he succeeded, he would achieve something no one else had done. If he failed, well, at least he would have tried something magnificent rather than fading into obscurity. There was, of course, one significant obstacle: he needed a boat. Slocum had no money to purchase a suitable vessel. The maritime community, aware of his straitened circumstances, rallied to help. An old friend, Captain Eben Pierce, offered Slocum a boat that was sitting neglected in a pasture in Fairhaven, Massachusetts. It was an ancient oyster boat, a derelict that had been sitting unused for years. Most men would have looked at this decaying hulk and seen only firewood. But Joshua Slocum saw potential. The boat was called the Spray, and it would become one of the most famous vessels in maritime history. But in 1891, when Slocum first laid eyes on it, the Spray was anything but famous. It was a wreck, its planks rotted, its rigging long since removed, grass growing up through its deck. It measured just over 36 feet from stem to stern, with a beam of 14 feet. It was, by the standards of vessels that attempted long-distance voyaging, tiny. But it had good bones, a solid design, a long keel for stability, and a hull shape that, if properly restored, might prove seaworthy. Slocum set to work with determination born of desperation and vision. He established himself in a field in Fairhaven and essentially rebuilt the Spray from the ground up. He replaced nearly every plank, using the best materials he could afford or scrounge. He fashioned new rigging. He installed new decking. He worked through the fall and winter of 1891, through the spring and summer of 1892, laboring mostly alone, occasionally with the help of friends or his sons. Money was tight, so he had to be creative and frugal, using salvaged materials where possible, bartering labor for supplies, stretching every dollar. This was painstaking work, requiring not just carpentry skills but also deep knowledge of ship construction, of how forces act on a hull, of what makes a vessel seaworthy. Slocum drew on his decades of experience, building the Spray not for speed or cargo capacity but for one specific purpose: to carry him safely around the world. He reinforced critical areas. He paid special attention to the keel and ballast, ensuring the boat would be stable and self-righting even in the worst conditions. He designed the rig, a gaff sloop configuration, to be manageable by one man, with all lines leading back to the cockpit where he could handle them without leaving the helm. After 13 months of intensive labor, on June 21, 1892, Joshua Slocum launched the rebuilt Spray. The vessel that slid into the water bore little resemblance to the derelict he had started with. This was now a sound, seaworthy craft, capable of facing the world's oceans. But it was still small, remarkably small for the journey Slocum had in mind. Most sailing vessels attempting circumnavigation were significantly larger, with full crews to handle the demanding work of sailing and navigation. The Spray was just 36 feet 9 inches long, and it would carry a crew of 1. Slocum spent the next 2.5 years preparing for his voyage. He sailed the Spray along the coast, testing her handling characteristics, making adjustments, learning her quirks and capabilities. He gathered supplies and equipment. He studied charts and pilot books, planning his route. He also needed to deal with practical matters like how to finance the voyage. Eventually, he struck a deal with a publisher. He would write about his journey, and the publisher would provide an advance and handle serialization of his accounts. This financial arrangement, while modest, gave him just enough resources to proceed. Finally, in the spring of 1895, everything was ready. Joshua Slocum was 51 years old, an age when most men of his era were well past their prime. His body bore the marks of a lifetime of hard work at sea. His beard was graying. Lines etched his weathered face. But his eyes still held the keen alertness of a seaman, and his spirit remained unbowed. On April 24, 1895, at noon, as Boston's 12 o'clock whistles blew, Joshua Slocum weighed anchor and set sail. His departure was not the grand affair one might expect for such an ambitious journey. There were no brass bands, no crowds cheering from the dock, no official send-offs. A photographer on the outer pier of East Boston managed to capture an image of the Spray as she sailed past, her flag flying from the peak. But otherwise, Slocum's departure was quiet, almost anticlimactic. He was, after all, just one aging sailor in a small boat, setting out on a journey that many believed he would never complete. Yet as the Spray moved down Boston Harbor on that spring afternoon, with a fair wind filling her sails and the open ocean ahead, Joshua Slocum felt a thrilling pulse beat high within him. His step was light on the deck in the crisp air. He felt there could be no turning back, that he was engaging in an adventure the meaning of which he thoroughly understood. Behind him lay decades of maritime experience, all the skills and knowledge accumulated over a lifetime at sea. Before him lay the unknown, thousands of miles of open ocean, countless challenges and dangers, the possibility of glory or death or anything in between. The Spray sailed east, moving away from the familiar waters of the Massachusetts coast. Slocum's plan was to first visit his boyhood home in Nova Scotia, a sentimental journey before beginning the true circumnavigation. He sailed north along the coast, stopping at several ports, renewing old acquaintances, revisiting places he had known as a boy. He arrived at Briar Island, where he had lived as a child, where his father's boot shop had stood, where he had first dreamed of a life at sea. It must have been a bittersweet visit, so much had changed, so many years had passed, and yet the essential character of the place remained the same. Slocum explored the coast of Nova Scotia, sailing among its myriad islands and harbors, navigating waters he had first learned to sail as a boy. He visited relatives and old friends, shared meals and stories, and perhaps found some closure with his past. But this was not merely a nostalgic ramble. He was also continuing to test the Spray, to understand her behavior in different conditions, to practice the routines that would sustain him during the long months ahead. On July 3, 1895, Joshua Slocum officially began his circumnavigation. His departure point was Sambro Island Lighthouse, near Halifax, Nova Scotia, one of the oldest operating lighthouses in the Americas. As the Spray passed this landmark and headed out into the open Atlantic, Slocum was truly committed. There would be no more coastal cruising, no more visits to familiar ports. From this point forward, every mile sailed would carry him farther from home, deeper into the challenge he had set for himself. Slocum's original plan was to sail eastward around the world, using the Suez Canal to transit from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea and onward to the Indian Ocean. This was the most direct route, and it had the advantage of keeping him in relatively well-traveled waters for much of the journey. He set his course for the Azores, then Gibraltar, intending to enter the Mediterranean and proceed from there. The crossing to the Azores went smoothly. The Spray proved to be an excellent sea boat, riding the Atlantic swells with ease. Slocum quickly discovered one of the vessel's most remarkable characteristics: the Spray could sail herself. By carefully balancing the sails and adjusting the helm, he could lash the wheel in position and the boat would hold her course for hours, sometimes for days, with no intervention from him. This self-steering capability was extraordinary and would prove invaluable. It meant that Slocum could sleep, cook, navigate, or perform maintenance without constantly returning to the wheel. He could even leave the deck entirely during good weather, knowing the Spray would maintain her heading. This ability to self-steer was due to several factors. The Spray's long keel provided directional stability, her sail plan, with the mast positioned well forward, created a balance between the forces acting on the hull, and her hull shape, while not particularly fast, was forgiving and stable. Modern sailors sometimes dismiss Slocum's accounts of the Spray's self-steering as exaggeration, but numerous witnesses confirmed that the vessel could indeed sail herself for extended periods with no one at the helm. The passage across the Atlantic gave Slocum time to establish his routines and rhythms. He was alone on an empty ocean, with no company save the seabirds that occasionally followed the boat and the dolphins that sometimes played in the bow wave. Solitude of this magnitude can be psychologically challenging. Most people, accustomed to constant human interaction, find extended isolation difficult or even unbearable. But Slocum, who had spent his life at sea, seemed to embrace it. He read books from his small library, made observations of the weather and sea conditions, maintained the boat, cooked simple meals, and sailed on. Navigation was done in the traditional manner, using celestial observations. Slocum would shoot the sun at local noon with his sextant to determine latitude, and he used dead reckoning, carefully recording the boat's speed and direction, to estimate longitude. Remarkably, he did not carry a chronometer, that precision timepiece essential for calculating longitude from celestial observations. Instead, he relied primarily on dead reckoning, using only a cheap tin clock for approximate time. This made his navigation more challenging and less precise, but Slocum's decades of experience made him confident in his ability to estimate position and arrive safely at his intended destinations. After a good crossing, the Spray arrived at the Azores, where Slocum stopped briefly before continuing on to Gibraltar. It was as he approached Gibraltar that Slocum's plans changed dramatically. He learned that piracy was still prevalent in the southern Mediterranean, particularly along the North African coast. For a lone sailor in a small boat, heavily laden with supplies and vulnerable to boarding, sailing through these waters would be extremely dangerous. Slocum realized that his original plan to use the Suez route was untenable. He would have to find another way around the world. The alternative was to sail westward, in the southern hemisphere, the route that the old clipper ships had used, down to Brazil, through the Strait of Magellan or around Cape Horn, then across the vast Pacific, around Australia, and across the Indian Ocean, around the Cape of Good Hope, and back north through the Atlantic to home. This route was longer and more challenging, but it would keep him in open waters where he could use his sailing skills to advantage and avoid the threat of piracy. This decision marked a crucial turning point in the voyage. Instead of sailing through relatively protected waters for much of the journey, Slocum would now face some of the most challenging sailing conditions on Earth. He would encounter the legendary storms of the Southern Ocean, navigate the treacherous waters around South America's southern tip, and cross enormous stretches of empty ocean where help would be impossible if anything went wrong. But Slocum was undaunted. Indeed, perhaps he even relished the challenge. This route would test him in ways the original plan never would have. It would require every ounce of his skill and experience. And it would take him through waters made famous by the great sailing ships of the past, allowing him to follow quite literally in the wakes of his maritime heroes. So the Spray turned southwest, away from the Mediterranean, heading toward Brazil and the beginning of the truly epic portion of Joshua Slocum's solo circumnavigation of the world. The passage across the Atlantic from Gibraltar toward South America was Slocum's first extended experience of truly open ocean sailing aboard the Spray. Day after day, the small sloop sailed southward and westward, riding the northeast trade winds that blow consistently in those latitudes. These were the same winds that had carried Columbus to the New World centuries earlier, the same atmospheric rivers that powered the age of exploration, and now they filled the Spray's canvas and pushed her steadily across the blue water. Life aboard the Spray during these passages developed its own rhythm and routine. Slocum would rise with the dawn, emerging from his small cabin below decks to check the weather, examine the sails and rigging, and take stock of the Spray's position and condition. He kept meticulous records in his log, noting the wind direction and strength, the sea state, the clouds, and any weather changes, the boat's estimated position based on his calculations. This discipline, ingrained through decades as a professional ship's captain, served him well. Even alone on an empty ocean with no one to report to, he maintained the standards of proper seamanship. Breakfast was typically a simple affair: hardtack biscuits, perhaps some tinned meat or fish, coffee brewed on the small stove in the cabin. Fresh provisions from Gibraltar, bread, fruit, vegetables, would last only a few days at sea before spoiling in the warm tropical air. After that, Slocum's diet consisted primarily of preserved foods, salted beef and pork, dried fish, tinned goods, dried beans and rice, hardtack, and coffee. It was a monotonous diet by modern standards, but it was nutritious enough to keep him healthy and was typical for sailors of that era. After breakfast, if the weather was fair and the Spray was sailing well, Slocum might spend time reading. He carried a small library aboard, books provided by his publisher as part of their agreement. These included classics of literature, poetry, philosophy, and maritime narratives. Reading provided not just entertainment but also intellectual stimulation during the long days alone. He could lose himself in the works of Shakespeare or Milton, could contemplate the ideas of great thinkers, could vicariously experience other voyages and adventures through the written word. This mental nourishment was as important as physical sustenance for maintaining his psychological well-being during months of solitude. Navigation occupied a significant portion of each day. Around local noon, when the sun reached its highest point in the sky, Slocum would take a sight with his sextant. This brass instrument, seemingly simple but actually quite sophisticated, allowed him to measure the angle between the sun and the horizon. From this measurement, combined with knowledge of the date and time, he could calculate his latitude with reasonable precision. Longitude was trickier without a chronometer. It required careful dead reckoning, adding up all the miles sailed each day in each direction, adjusting for currents and leeway, and keeping a running estimate of position. It was an inexact science, requiring judgment and experience, but Slocum had both in abundance. He would then plot his position on his charts, large paper sheets showing the coastlines, water depths, hazards, and other features of the ocean. These charts were works of art in their own right, the product of centuries of exploration and surveying, with beautiful copperplate engraving and elegant typography. Slocum would carefully mark his estimated position, draw a line showing his track across the ocean, and planned the course for the days ahead. This ritual of position fixing and chart work was deeply satisfying. It gave concrete evidence of progress, showing graphically how each day's sailing brought him closer to his next destination. Maintenance was another constant task. A wooden boat at sea requires regular attention. Slocum would inspect the rigging, looking for chafe or signs of wear. He would grease the blocks and sheaves to keep them running smoothly. He would check the seams of the deck and hull, applying more caulking or tar where needed to keep them watertight. He would service the running rigging, the lines used to control the sails, replacing any that showed excessive wear. In calm weather, he might go aloft, climbing the mast to examine the masthead fittings and the condition of the sails at close range. All of this work was physically demanding, especially for a man in his early 50s working alone, but it was also necessary. A well-maintained boat was a safe boat, and neglecting maintenance at sea could lead to failures at the worst possible moment. The Spray herself proved to be a remarkably forgiving and capable vessel. Her deep keel and heavy displacement made her stable and sea-kindly. She rode over waves rather than crashing through them, and she recovered quickly from any heel or roll. Her self-steering capability was extraordinary and, frankly, almost magical. Slocum would adjust the sails and helm just so, and the Spray would hold her course hour after hour, sometimes for an entire day or night, without his touching the wheel. This allowed him to sleep soundly, to work below decks, to cook and eat meals, all while the boat sailed herself across the ocean. Many modern sailors have attempted to replicate this quality by building boats to the Spray's plans, with varying degrees of success. The precise combination of hull shape, ballast distribution, and sail plan that made the original Spray so tractable remains somewhat mysterious even today. The ocean itself was a constant companion and source of wonder. On calm days, the water might be smooth as glass, reflecting the sky like a mirror, with only the gentlest of swells passing beneath the hull. On such days, Slocum could see deep into the clear blue water, watching fish swim past, seeing the shadow of the boat on the sandy bottom if he was crossing a shallow area. Flying fish would occasionally burst from the water and glide for remarkable distances before splashing back in. Dolphins would sometimes appear, swimming alongside the boat, playing in the bow wave, their sleek bodies cutting through the water with effortless grace. At other times, the sea would be more active. Trade wind conditions often meant steady 20-knot winds and corresponding seas, waves 6 to 10 feet high marching in regular procession across the ocean, their surfaces striped with white foam. In such conditions, the Spray would heel to one side, her lee rail occasionally dipping into the water, and she would surge forward with a satisfying rush as each wave passed beneath her. These were ideal sailing conditions, steady, predictable, allowing the boat to make good progress without being uncomfortably violent. But Slocum also experienced the ocean's more aggressive moods. Squalls would materialize with little warning, dark clouds racing across the sky, the wind suddenly backing or veering and increasing dramatically in strength. Rain would fall in sheets, driven nearly horizontal by the wind. In such conditions, Slocum would need to reef the sails quickly, reducing their area to prevent the boat from being overpowered. This meant leaving the relative safety of the cockpit and going forward on deck, working with cold, wet ropes, often while the boat pitched and rolled, sometimes with waves breaking over the deck. It was hard, sometimes dangerous work, requiring strength, agility, and a complete focus on the task at hand. A moment of inattention, a slip on the wet deck, could result in serious injury or even being washed overboard, which, alone in the middle of the ocean, would mean certain death. Through all of this, Slocum developed a deep relationship with the Spray. The boat became more than just a vessel, she became partner, home, and lifeline all in one. He learned to interpret the sounds she made, the way she moved through the water, the tension in the helm. He could sense when something was not quite right, when a sail needed adjustment or when weather was about to change. This intuitive connection between sailor and boat is something that develops only with time and experience, and Slocum had both. As the Spray approached the coast of South America, Slocum had to make decisions about his exact route. The eastern coast of South America presents a variety of options for a southbound vessel. He could sail close to the coast, stopping at Brazilian ports for provisions and information. Or he could stand farther offshore, using the favorable winds and currents of the open ocean. Slocum chose a middle path, keeping the coast in sight when weather permitted but not venturing into shallow waters or among the many hazards that line the shoreline. The coast of Brazil, when visible from offshore, presented a remarkable vista. Long beaches of white sand stretched for miles, backed by tropical vegetation. In some places, mountains rose directly from the sea, their peaks wreathed in clouds. Fishing villages dotted the shore, their presence marked by the small boats that ventured out to sea each day. Occasionally, larger vessels would be visible, coastal traders, fishing boats, or the rare steamship making its way between ports. But for the most part, the ocean was empty. The Spray sailed through a vast blue wilderness, with the curve of the earth limiting visibility to a dozen miles or so in any direction. The weather as Slocum sailed south along the Brazilian coast was generally favorable. The South Atlantic High, a semi-permanent area of high pressure that sits over the South Atlantic Ocean, creates generally stable conditions along this coast. Winds blow steadily from the east or southeast, temperatures are warm but not oppressive, and the sea state, while often lively, is rarely dangerous. For a skilled sailor in a capable boat, these are near-ideal conditions for making southing, for making progress toward the south. As he sailed, Slocum had time to reflect on the magnitude of what he had undertaken. He was now thousands of miles from home, alone on an ocean that had humbled countless sailors before him. He was past the point of easy return. If he turned back now, he would be admitting failure, proving the skeptics right who said he was too old, or that the Spray was inadequate, or that the whole enterprise was folly. Forward was the only direction that made sense. Forward toward the Strait of Magellan, toward the Pacific, toward the completion of his dream. The loneliness of long-distance single-handed sailing is difficult to fully appreciate unless experienced. Modern sailors with satellite communications can call home, can send emails, can maintain contact with the world they left behind. But Slocum had none of this. Once he sailed beyond sight of land, he was utterly alone in a way that is almost impossible to achieve in today's connected world. There were no voices except his own, no faces except his reflection in the small mirror in the cabin, no human contact of any kind. Days would pass, then weeks, with nothing but the wind, the waves, the clouds, and the occasional seabird for company. How did he cope with this extreme isolation? Part of the answer lies in his personality and background. Slocum had spent his entire adult life at sea, often in circumstances where he was relatively isolated even on ships with full crews. Captains maintain a certain distance from their crews, it is necessary for discipline and command. So in some ways, Slocum had been preparing for this solitude his entire career. He was comfortable with his own company, capable of entertaining himself with books and thoughts, and possessed of that particular variety of mental toughness that allows some people to thrive in isolation while others would suffer. But there were challenges. Slocum occasionally reported experiencing hallucinations, seeing figures on deck that were not there, hearing voices in the wind. These episodes, while disturbing, are not uncommon among solo sailors subjected to extreme isolation, irregular sleep, and the constant stress of managing a boat at sea. The mind, deprived of external stimulation, sometimes creates its own. Slocum seemed to take these experiences in stride, recognizing them for what they were and not allowing them to undermine his confidence or judgment. As the Spray continued south, the weather gradually began to change. The warm tropical conditions of the Brazilian coast gave way to cooler temperatures as Slocum sailed beyond the Tropic of Capricorn into the temperate latitudes of the South Atlantic. The sea state became more challenging, larger waves, more frequent storms, more variable winds. This was a taste of what was to come, for ahead lay some of the most difficult sailing waters in the world. The eastern coast of South America curves westward as it extends south, eventually reaching the broad estuary of the Rio de la Plata, where the cities of Buenos Aires and Montevideo sit on opposite shores. Slocum sailed past this area, and memories must have flooded back. It was here, at Buenos Aires, that Virginia had died 11 years earlier. It was from nearby that he had begun his incredible journey home in the Libertad. The coast held both tragic memories and reminders of his resilience and resourcefulness. Continuing south from the Plata region, the character of the coast changes dramatically. The pampas of Argentina, endless, flat grasslands, extend to the sea. The shore becomes less hospitable, windswept, and often fog-shrouded. This is Patagonia, a name that has come to represent remoteness and wildness. The Spanish who first explored this region reported seeing giants, the Patagones, who left enormous footprints on the beaches. While the giants proved mythical, the region's reputation for difficulty was well-deserved. Slocum was now entering the latitude sailors called the Roaring Forties, roughly between 40 and 50 degrees south latitude, where the winds blow almost constantly from west to east, unimpeded by any significant landmass. These winds circle the globe at these latitudes, creating the fastest sailing route around the world for vessels traveling east. But for a westbound vessel like the Spray, heading toward the Strait of Magellan and eventually the Pacific, these winds would be on the nose, dead ahead, making every mile a hard-fought struggle. The Strait of Magellan lies at approximately 52 degrees south latitude, in a gap between the mainland of South America and the large island of Tierra del Fuego. This strait, discovered by Ferdinand Magellan in 1520 during the first circumnavigation of the globe, provides a protected passage between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. It is an alternative to rounding Cape Horn, which lies at the southern tip of Tierra del Fuego and involves sailing through the open waters of the Drake Passage. The choice between using the strait or rounding the Horn is one that sailing vessels have grappled with for centuries. The strait is shorter, more sheltered, and avoids the notoriously violent conditions of the open Drake Passage. But it has its own challenges. It is narrow in places, sometimes only a couple of miles wide. It is subject to willy-waws, sudden, violent windstorms that sweep down from the mountains without warning and can lay a ship on her beam ends. The navigation is tricky, with rocks and shoals, strong currents, and rapidly changing conditions. For a single-hander, all of these difficulties are magnified. There would be no one to help handle sails if conditions deteriorated rapidly, no one to help anchor or navigate through narrow passages, no one to stand watch while the captain slept. Slocum approached this decision with characteristic pragmatism. He studied his charts carefully, reviewed the pilot books that described conditions in the strait, and considered his options. He decided to attempt the strait, believing that his skills and the Spray's capabilities would be sufficient to navigate its challenges. It was a bold decision, and one that would test him severely in the weeks ahead. The entrance to the Strait of Magellan is marked by several prominent landmarks. From the east, navigators look for Cape Virgins on the mainland side and Cape Espiritu Santo on the Tierra del Fuego side. Between these capes lies the entrance to the strait, a passage perhaps 20 miles wide, with strong tidal currents that can reach several knots. These currents are crucial to understand, as they can either assist or hinder a sailing vessel's progress significantly. Slocum timed his approach to take advantage of the tidal currents, entering on a favorable flood tide. The Spray swept through the entrance and into the first reach of the strait. This initial section is relatively wide and straightforward, running generally westward between low shores of grass and scrub. To the north, the flat plains of Patagonia stretched to the horizon. To the south, Tierra del Fuego, the land of fire, so named because early explorers saw the fires of native encampments along its shores, presented a more mountainous profile. The weather in the strait was immediately different from the open ocean. The surrounding land modified the wind patterns, creating eddies and puffs and lulls. Sometimes the wind would be blowing strongly from one direction at the entrance to the strait but would shift to a completely different direction a few miles farther in. This made sailing challenging and unpredictable. Slocum had to stay alert, constantly adjusting the sails and helm to respond to these changes. As the spray progressed deeper into the strait, the passage began to narrow. The shores closed in on both sides, and mountains became visible in the distance, the beginning of the Andes chain that runs the length of South America. These mountains created their own weather patterns. Clouds would build up against their peaks, releasing rain or snow. Cold air would flow down from the heights, creating those willy-waws that made the strait so dangerous. Slocum experienced his first willy-waw on his second day in the strait. The morning had been relatively calm, with light winds and overcast skies. He was sailing with reduced canvas, being cautious in these confined waters. Suddenly, without any warning, a blast of wind came screaming down from the mountains. The spray heeled over violently, her lee rail going under, water pouring over the deck. Slocum had just seconds to react, letting fly some sheets to spill wind from the sails, turning the boat to reduce the angle of heel, fighting to maintain control. As quickly as it had arrived, the willy-waw passed, leaving the spray rocking in its wake, Slocum's heart pounding from the adrenaline rush. He had heard about these sudden windstorms, had read accounts of ships dismasted or capsized by them, but experiencing one firsthand was sobering. From that point on, Slocum sailed with even greater caution. He kept the sails reefed more than normal, sacrificing speed for safety. He stayed alert for any signs of an approaching willy-waw, a darkening of the water surface, a slight backing of the wind, a line of disturbed air moving across the surface. When possible, he would anchor the spray in sheltered coves at night rather than attempting to sail through darkness in these dangerous waters. This meant slow progress, but it was the prudent approach for a lone sailor in a small boat. The Strait of Magellan is remarkable for its dramatic changes in character along its length. The eastern section, as mentioned, is relatively wide and open. But as the strait progresses westward, it narrows considerably. At the narrowest point, called Primera Angostura, or First Narrows, the passage is barely a mile wide, with strong currents rushing through like a river. Beyond this constriction, the strait opens again into a broader body of water, before once more narrowing at Segunda Angostura, the Second Narrows. Slocum navigated these narrows with intense concentration. The spray had to thread through swiftly moving water, often with winds that seemed determined to push her toward one shore or the other. There were moments when it seemed the boat would be swept onto rocks, when disaster appeared imminent, but each time, through a combination of skill, luck, and the spray's responsive handling, Slocum managed to maintain control and thread his way through. Beyond the Second Narrows, the strait becomes less defined. It branches into various channels and passages, separated by islands. The shores become more mountainous, with steep slopes rising directly from the water. Forests of southern beech cling to these slopes, their branches constantly bent by the prevailing westerly winds. Glacier can be seen in the distance, their blue ice glinting in whatever sunlight manages to penetrate the frequent clouds. This is a landscape of raw, almost primordial beauty, a place that seems barely touched by human presence. But it is also a harsh and unforgiving environment. The weather is notoriously bad, with rain or snow on most days, clouds often hanging low over the water, and visibility frequently limited. The water temperature is cold enough that survival time if one fell overboard would be measured in minutes. There is virtually no human habitation, just the occasional fishing settlement or scientific station, and even these are few and far between. For Slocum, progressing through this landscape was both thrilling and exhausting. Each day brought new challenges, navigating narrow channels, handling sudden weather changes, finding adequate anchorages, dealing with the physical demands of constantly trimming sails and handling the boat. He got little restful sleep, as he had to remain alert for dangers. He ate poorly, as cooking in the constantly moving cabin was difficult. His clothes were perpetually damp from rain and spray. Yet despite all this, he pressed on, determined to complete the strait and reach the Pacific beyond. The western portion of the strait is perhaps the most challenging. Here, the mountains rise directly from the water to substantial heights. The channels twist and turn between these peaks, and the winds funnel through these passages with tremendous force. Rain falls almost constantly, and visibility is often measured in hundreds of yards rather than miles. For sailing directions, Slocum had to rely on his charts and pilot books, as well as his own observations and judgment. There were no GPS waypoints, no depth sounders with digital displays, no radar to see through the fog. Just his eyes, his charts, his lead line for checking depth, and his decades of experience. Finally, after more than 40 days of battling through the Strait of Magellan, a passage that Slocum himself described as taking far longer than he had anticipated due to adverse winds and weather, the spray emerged into the Pacific Ocean. The moment when he cleared the western entrance of the strait and felt the long Pacific swell rolling beneath his hull must have been one of profound relief mixed with new apprehension. He had successfully navigated one of the most challenging passages in the world. But now he faced the greatest ocean on Earth, the Pacific, which covers nearly half of the planet's surface and presents its own formidable challenges. The western entrance to the Strait of Magellan opens into a complex region of channels, islands, and exposed waters. This is not a simple transition from strait to open ocean. Rather, it is a gradual emergence from protected waters into increasingly exposed conditions. The final stretch includes passages through the channels around the western edge of Tierra del Fuego, with names like Desolation Island and Fury Island that hint at the conditions early explorers encountered. For Slocum, clearing the strait meant he could finally turn the spray northward, along the coast of Chile, beginning the long Pacific crossing that would eventually take him to Australia and beyond. But before fully committing to this passage, he needed to address practical matters. His provisions, depleted during the extended battle through the strait, needed replenishment. The spray herself needed attention, rigging checked and tightened, sails repaired where chafe had worn through, and the hull examined for any damage sustained in the challenging waters of the strait. Chilean ports along the coast offered opportunities for these repairs and resupply. Slocum made his way north, stopping at several locations, each with its own character and challenges. These ports were small, often no more than fishing villages or minor commercial centers, but they provided the essentials he needed. The people he encountered were generally welcoming, though communication could be challenging given the language barriers. Spanish was the predominant language along the Chilean coast, and while Slocum had picked up some Spanish during his years of sailing to South American ports, he was far from fluent. At these stops, Slocum would also take care of correspondence. He would send letters home, letting his family and publisher know of his progress. He would receive mail that had been sent to these ports in anticipation of his arrival, letters from family, friends, and even readers who had been following the serialized accounts of his voyage. These connections to home, though separated by weeks or months of mail transit time, provided an important psychological anchor. They reminded him that beyond the oceanic solitude of his voyage, there was a world of people interested in his journey and hoping for his safe return. The Pacific coast of South America presents a stark contrast to the Atlantic side. Where the Atlantic coast is relatively low-lying and features long beaches and gentle topography, the Pacific coast is dominated by the presence of the Andes Mountains, which in many places come right down to the sea. The result is a dramatically vertical landscape, steep cliffs rising from the water, narrow beaches backed by towering mountains, fjords cutting deep into the coastline. It is scenery of spectacular beauty but also of inherent danger for mariners, as rocky shores and limited harbors mean there are few safe refuges if weather turns bad. Slocum's plan was to sail north along this coast to more moderate latitudes before turning west to begin the true Pacific crossing. This route would allow him to escape the worst of the Southern Hemisphere's winter weather while also putting him in a position to pick up the trade winds that blow steadily across the Pacific at lower latitudes. It was the route that countless vessels had taken before, the clipper ships carrying Chilean copper and nitrates to ports around the world, the whaling ships that had hunted the Pacific's vast populations of whales, the explorers and traders who had opened up the Pacific to commerce over preceding centuries. As he sailed north, the weather gradually improved. The constant rain and clouds of the southern latitudes gave way to more settled conditions. The water temperature increased, making working on deck more pleasant. The wildlife changed as well. The albatrosses and petrels of the Southern Ocean were replaced by different species of seabirds, and occasionally, schools of dolphins would appear to escort the spray for a while. The Chilean coast is long, stretching more than 2,600 miles from the southern tip to the northern border with Peru. This gave Slocum ample time to observe the land and its people, to reflect on his journey so far, and to prepare mentally and practically for the enormous Pacific crossing that lay ahead. He was now roughly 6 months into his voyage, having departed Boston in April and emerged from the Strait of Magellan in early October. He had covered perhaps 10,000 miles, battled through some of the most difficult sailing waters in the world, and proved both to himself and to any doubters that he and the Spray were capable of handling extreme challenges. But the journey was far from over. Indeed, in many ways, it was just beginning. The Pacific crossing would be the longest single leg of his circumnavigation, thousands of miles of empty ocean with no land, no harbors, no possibility of assistance if something went wrong. He would be sailing through tropical waters where hurricanes could form with little warning, through remote island groups where reefs and atolls posed navigation hazards, and through vast stretches where the solitude would be even more profound than anything he had yet experienced. Slocum spent his time in Chilean ports preparing for this challenge. He studied his charts of the Pacific, planning his route carefully. The Pacific is dotted with islands, some large, some tiny, some inhabited, most not. These islands could serve as waypoints, as places to rest and reprovision, but they also represented hazards. Many were poorly charted, with reefs and shoals that might not be accurately marked. Approaching them required careful navigation and good visibility, neither of which could be guaranteed. The prevailing winds and currents of the Pacific would also play a crucial role in determining his route. The trade winds blow generally from east to west in the tropical latitudes, providing steady winds for westward progress. But they are not constant. There are doldrums near the equator where winds can be light and variable, and there are seasonal variations in the wind patterns. Currents, too, follow predictable patterns, but understanding and using them effectively requires knowledge and judgment. Slocum also had to consider the seasonal weather patterns. The Pacific is home to tropical cyclones, called hurricanes in the eastern Pacific and typhoons in the western Pacific. These massive storms could easily overwhelm a small boat like the Spray. While they follow somewhat predictable seasonal patterns, with a defined cyclone season in each region, they can occur outside these normal times, and predicting their exact tracks and intensities was beyond the capability of late 19th century meteorology. Slocum would have to rely on careful observation of weather signs and on being in the right places at the right times to minimize his exposure to these dangers. As Slocum prepared to leave the South American coast behind and strike out across the Pacific, he must have felt both excitement and trepidation. Excitement because he was about to sail across the largest ocean on Earth, following in the wakes of great explorers like Magellan, Cook, and countless others. Trepidation because he would be utterly alone on this vast expanse of water, with no possibility of help if disaster struck. His life would depend entirely on his skills, his judgment, the seaworthiness of the spray, and no small amount of luck. The provisions he loaded aboard were substantial. He would need food for several months at sea: hardtack, salt meat, dried beans, rice, flour, coffee, tea, and whatever tinned goods he could obtain. He took on fresh water, filling every tank and container aboard, knowing that water would be his most critical resource. Without adequate water, he could not survive, no matter how much food he had. He also stocked spare parts and materials for repairs, extra rope, canvas for sail repairs, tools, wood, nails, and everything else that might be needed to keep the spray functional during the long passage ahead. One item Slocum reportedly loaded aboard that has become legendary was tacks, small, sharp carpet tacks. The story goes that in one of the channels near the Strait of Magellan, he had been approached by a canoe of native people, likely Yargan or one of the other indigenous groups that lived in this region. Concerned about potential theft or violence, Slocum had sprinkled tacks on the spray's deck. When the natives attempted to board during the night, they stepped on the tacks and quickly retreated. Whether this story is entirely accurate or somewhat embellished in the retelling is unclear, but it speaks to the isolation and vulnerability Slocum felt in these remote waters, as well as his resourcefulness in dealing with potential threats. As he worked to prepare the spray and himself for the Pacific crossing, Slocum was also very much aware of the historical significance of what he was attempting. The Pacific had been crossed by sailing vessels countless times over the preceding centuries, but never by a single individual sailing alone, without crew, without the support that even a small crew provides. If he succeeded in crossing the Pacific and continuing around the world, he would achieve something unprecedented in maritime history. If he failed, well, the Pacific had swallowed countless sailors over the centuries, and one more would make little difference to the ocean. The coast of Chile, as Slocum sailed north, presented an ever-changing panorama. Fishing villages clung to sheltered coves. Small ports exported the products of Chile's mining and agricultural industries. In larger centers like Valparaiso, he could see the influence of European architecture and culture transplanted to this distant shore. The people were a mix: indigenous peoples, Spanish descendants, immigrants from various parts of Europe, all trying to make lives in this remote corner of the world. Slocum's interactions with the Chileans he met were generally positive. Despite language barriers, sailors tend to recognize and respect other sailors, and Slocum's obvious competence and the seaworthiness of the spray earned him respect. He would share tales of his voyage so far, and locals would share their knowledge of winds, currents, and conditions farther north. This informal sharing of information, this community of maritime knowledge, was one of the great traditions of the sea, and Slocum benefited from it even as he contributed his own observations and experiences. As spring advanced in the southern hemisphere, for it was now October moving toward November, conditions along the Chilean coast continued to improve. The days grew longer and warmer. The storms became less frequent. The sea state moderated. These were ideal conditions for beginning the Pacific crossing, and Slocum began to feel the familiar restlessness that comes when a sailor knows it is time to depart, time to continue the journey. He took on a final load of provisions, topped off his water tanks one last time, made one final check of the spray's rigging and gear, and prepared to set sail. The exact date of his departure from the South American coast and beginning of the true Pacific crossing would mark a new chapter in his incredible journey, the chapter that would test him and the spray more than anything that had come before, that would push them both to their limits, and that would ultimately demonstrate whether this audacious dream of solo circumnavigation was truly achievable. The 36-foot spray emerged from the Strait of Magellan into the Pacific Ocean on March 3, 1896, after 40 days of battling through one of the most treacherous waterways on Earth. Slocum had faced willy wars that threatened to capsize his boat, navigated channels so narrow that the trees on either side seemed to reach out and touch the rigging, and anchored in remote coves where the sounds of civilization were replaced by the calls of unknown birds and the crash of distant waterfalls. Now, as the Spray's bow pointed westward into the vast expanse of the Pacific, Joshua Slocum faced a different kind of challenge entirely. The Pacific Ocean stretches across nearly half the surface of our planet. It's an expanse so enormous that all the continents of Earth could fit within its boundaries with room to spare. When Magellan first crossed it in 1520, he named it Mar Pacifico, the peaceful sea, because after the storms and horrors of the strait that now bears his name, the waters seemed remarkably calm. But Slocum knew better than to trust that reputation completely. The Pacific could be tranquil for weeks at a time, lulling sailors into a false sense of security, and then suddenly unleash storms of terrifying power. It was an ocean that demanded respect, vigilance, and above all, patience. Slocum's route across the Pacific would take him through thousands of miles of open water, past countless islands, and through waters that had witnessed centuries of exploration, colonization, and conflict. Unlike his Atlantic crossing, where he had faced the familiar challenges of North Atlantic weather patterns, the Pacific presented an entirely different set of circumstances. Trade winds would carry him westward, but he would need to navigate through island chains, avoid coral reefs that could rip the bottom out of his boat, and manage his provisions carefully because opportunities for resupply would be few and far between. The first leg of this Pacific crossing took Slocum northward along the coast of Chile. He stopped at several ports, including Valparaiso, where he could replenish his stores and make any necessary repairs to the Spray. The Chilean coast, with its dramatic cliffs and bustling ports, provided a final taste of civilization before the long crossing ahead. Slocum knew that once he left the South American coast behind, he would be truly alone in a way that even his Atlantic crossing hadn't prepared him for. From Chile, Slocum set his course for Juan Fernandez Islands, about 400 miles off the Chilean coast. These islands, famous as the setting that inspired Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, held a special fascination for sailors. The real-life castaway Alexander Selkirk had spent for years alone on one of these islands in the early 1700s, and Slocum, himself now a solitary sailor, felt a kinship with that long-ago mariner. He anchored off the island and spent several days there, exploring the rugged landscape and marveling at the wild goats that descended from animals left by Spanish sailors centuries before. Leaving Juan Fernandez behind, Slocum pointed the Spray's bow toward the Marquesas Islands, more than 3,000 miles to the northwest. This would be his longest stretch at sea so far, a journey that would test both his seamanship and his psychological resilience. Day after day, the Spray sailed on across waters that seemed to have no end. The trade winds filled her sails consistently, and Slocum perfected his self-steering arrangements, balancing the sails and helm so that the boat could sail herself for hours at a time while he read, cooked, or simply watched the endless procession of waves. The solitude of those weeks was profound. Slocum would sometimes go days without seeing another vessel. The ocean around him was alive with life, dolphins played in the bow wave, flying fish skittered across the surface like stones skipped by a giant hand, and seabirds wheeled overhead, but these were his only companions. At night, the stars spread across the sky in patterns so clear and brilliant that Slocum could navigate by them with an ease born of decades at sea. He took celestial sightings with his sextant, calculating his position with the mathematical precision that had guided mariners for centuries. But the Pacific crossing wasn't without its challenges. Squalls would blow up suddenly, forcing Slocum to scramble to reduce sail before the wind could damage his rigging. The Spray would heel over dramatically, water rushing along her deck, and Slocum would brace himself against the tiller, guiding his boat through the storm with the practiced ease of a man who had spent his entire adult life at sea. When the squalls passed, the ocean would return to its previous calm, as if the violent winds had never existed at all. Provisions were another constant concern. Slocum had loaded the Spray with enough food to last for weeks, but he knew that fresh supplies would be scarce until he reached the islands ahead. He caught fish when he could, trailing a line behind the boat and hauling in tuna, dolphin fish, and other species. He rationed his water carefully, knowing that while he could survive for weeks without much food, a lack of fresh water would be fatal. Rain squalls provided opportunities to collect water, and Slocum would spread canvas to catch the rain, funneling it into his storage barrels. The psychological challenge of such extended solitude cannot be overstated. Modern sailors often speak of the mental difficulties of single-handed ocean crossing, the isolation, the constant vigilance, the way that small problems can magnify in the mind until they seem insurmountable. Slocum dealt with these challenges through routine and discipline. He maintained a regular schedule, even in the middle of the ocean. He wrote in his journal every day, documenting his position, the weather conditions, and his observations about the sea around him. He read extensively, having brought a small library of books that kept his mind engaged during the long, empty days. After several weeks at sea, land appeared on the horizon. The Marquesas Islands rose from the ocean like dark mountains, their peaks shrouded in clouds, their valleys thick with tropical vegetation. Slocum sailed into Nuku-Hiva, the largest of the Marquesas, and dropped anchor in a bay so beautiful it seemed almost unreal after weeks of seeing nothing but water. The islands were populated by Polynesians, descendants of navigators who had crossed these same waters in double-hulled canoes centuries before European ships ever ventured into the Pacific. The Marquesas provided Slocum with his first opportunity for extended human contact in weeks. The islanders were friendly and curious about this solitary white man who had sailed into their waters alone. They brought him gifts of fruit, breadfruit, coconuts, bananas, all fresh and welcome after weeks of preserved rations. Slocum traded with them, exchanging small items for provisions, and he spent several days exploring the islands, hiking into the interior where ancient stone tikis watched over valleys that seemed lost in time. Herman Melville had visited these same islands in the 1840s, and his descriptions in Typee had made them famous in America. Slocum, who had read Melville's work, found himself comparing the reality of the Marquesas with Melville's romantic descriptions. The islands were indeed beautiful, but they also bore the scars of contact with the Western world. Diseases brought by European sailors had devastated the native population, and the traditional culture was slowly eroding under the influence of missionaries and colonial administrators. From the Marquesas, Slocum sailed westward to Samoa, another 2,000 miles across open ocean. This leg of the journey took him deeper into the heart of the Pacific, through waters where the trade winds blew steadily and the sun beat down with tropical intensity. The Spray handled the conditions beautifully, her design proving perfectly suited to ocean sailing. Slocum had complete confidence in his boat by now. She had carried him safely across the Atlantic, through the Strait of Magellan, and across thousands of miles of Pacific Ocean. He knew her quirks, her rhythms, the way she responded to every adjustment of sail and helm. Samoa was different from the Marquesas. While both were Polynesian islands, Samoa had been more heavily influenced by European colonization. Germany, Britain, and the United States all had interests in the islands, and the political situation was complex and sometimes tense. Slocum arrived in Apia, the main port, and found a bustling community that served as a waypoint for ships crossing the Pacific. He spent several weeks in Samoa, making repairs to the Spray, restocking his provisions, and recovering from the rigors of the ocean crossing. It was in Samoa that Slocum experienced one of the more memorable encounters of his voyage. Robert Louis Stevenson had lived in Samoa until his death in 1894, just a year before Slocum's arrival. The famous author had become something of a local legend, and Slocum visited his grave on Mount Via, overlooking the sea that Stevenson had loved. Standing there, looking out over the Pacific, Slocum felt a connection to the writer who had also understood the allure of islands and the sea. From Samoa, Slocum's route took him southwest toward Fiji and then on to Australia. The sailing continued to be excellent, with steady trade winds pushing the Spray along at a comfortable pace. Fiji, with its coral reefs and volcanic peaks, provided another opportunity to rest and resupply. The islands were a British colony by this time, and Slocum found a more familiar European atmosphere than he had experienced in the French Marquesas or the American-influenced Samoa. The passage from Fiji to Australia took Slocum through the Coral Sea, a body of water notorious for its hidden reefs and unpredictable weather. Navigation here required constant vigilance. A mistake could put the Spray onto a reef, and a boat damaged on a coral reef in the middle of the Pacific would likely mean the end of the voyage and possibly of the sailor himself. Slocum navigated these treacherous waters with skill born of experience, taking frequent soundings, consulting his charts constantly, and keeping a sharp lookout for any sign of shallow water or breaking waves that might indicate a reef ahead. The Coral Sea presented challenges that were entirely different from the deep-water ocean sailing Slocum had experienced crossing the Atlantic or the open Pacific. Here, the water changed color constantly, from deep blue in the channels between reefs to turquoise and then pale green over shallow coral. Slocum learned to read these color changes like a chart, knowing that each shift in hue meant a change in depth and potential danger. At night, navigation became even more treacherous. The moon reflecting off the water could create illusions, making it difficult to distinguish between safe channels and reef-strewn shallows. Slocum also had to contend with the currents that swept through the Coral Sea. These could be strong and unpredictable, setting the Spray off course and pushing her toward reefs even when the wind was favorable. He would take bearings on landmarks when he could see the coast, and when out of sight of land, he relied on his dead reckoning skills, constantly updating his calculations based on the Spray's speed, the direction of the wind, and his estimate of the current strength and direction. The region was also prone to tropical cyclones, particularly during the summer months from November till April. Slocum was making his passage in October, just at the beginning of cyclone season, and he knew he had to be prepared for the possibility of encountering one of these destructive storms. A tropical cyclone in the Coral Sea could generate winds of over 100 miles per hour and waves tall enough to overwhelm even a large ship. The Spray, for all her seaworthiness, would be helpless in the face of such conditions. Slocum's best defense was vigilance, watching the sky for signs of approaching weather, noting changes in the swell patterns, and being ready to alter course or seek shelter if necessary. When the Australian coast finally appeared on the horizon in October 1896, Slocum had been at sea, with only brief island stops, for over a year since leaving Boston. He sailed into Sydney Harbour, one of the finest natural harbours in the world, and dropped anchor among dozens of other vessels. Sydney was a thriving city, the largest in Australia, and it provided Slocum with a welcome return to civilization after so many months of solitude and primitive island communities. Sydney in 1896 was a city undergoing rapid growth and transformation. The population had swelled to over 400,000, making it larger than many European cities. The harbour was busy with commercial traffic, steamships loading wool and wheat for export to Britain, coastal vessels moving between Australian ports, and smaller craft of all descriptions. The city itself spread out from the harbour in all directions, a mix of Victorian-era buildings, newer structures reflecting the prosperity of the Gold Rush era, and older buildings dating back to the early days of the British colony. Slocum's arrival created quite a stir. Newspapers had been following his voyage through brief dispatches that had arrived via steamship mail from various ports, and Sydneysiders were eager to see this American sailor who had undertaken such an audacious adventure. The harbour master arranged for the Spray to be given a prominent anchorage, and within hours of his arrival, Slocum was receiving visitors. Sailors came to examine the Spray, asking detailed questions about her construction, her rig, and how she handled in various conditions. Journalists wanted interviews, seeking personal details about Slocum's life, his motivations for the voyage, and his experiences during the long months at sea. The maritime community in Sydney was particularly interested in Slocum's achievement. Australia, as an island nation, had a strong seafaring tradition, and Australians understood the magnitude of what Slocum was attempting. The local yacht clubs invited him to speak at their meetings, and Slocum found himself giving impromptu lectures about navigation, ocean sailing, and the places he had visited. He was not a natural public speaker, he was more comfortable at the helm of the Spray than behind a lectern, but he had stories that people wanted to hear, and he gradually became more adept at telling them. During his time in Sydney, the Spray was hauled out of the water for a thorough inspection. This was the first time since leaving Boston that the boat had been completely out of the water, and Slocum was curious to see how she had held up under the rigors of ocean sailing. The inspection revealed that the Spray was in remarkably good condition. Her hull showed the expected growth of marine organisms, barnacles, weed, and other creatures that attached themselves to any surface submerged in the ocean, but underneath the growth, the planking was sound. There were a few minor leaks that needed to be caulked, and some of the bottom paint had worn away and needed to be replaced, but overall, the Spray had proven herself to be a robust and reliable vessel. Slocum also used this time to make some improvements to the boat. He replaced several pieces of rigging that had shown wear, installed new running lights to make the Spray more visible to other vessels at night, and reorganized his below-deck storage to make better use of the limited space. He also took the opportunity to thoroughly clean the interior, which after over a year at sea had accumulated the inevitable grime and dampness that came with living aboard a small boat in the ocean environment. The Spray remained in Sydney for about a month, from late October into November. During this time, Slocum also had the opportunity to explore the city and its surroundings. He took the newly constructed railway into the Blue Mountains west of Sydney, marveling at the engineering feat that had carved a route through the rugged terrain. He visited botanical gardens where exotic plants from around the world grew alongside native Australian species. He walked through neighborhoods where grand Victorian mansions stood next to simple workers' cottages, each telling a story about the people who had built this city on the far side of the world from Britain. But Sydney was just the first stop on Slocum's Australian sojourn. From Sydney, he sailed southward along the coast to Melbourne, Victoria's capital and Australia's second-largest city. The coastal passage took him past dozens of small ports and fishing villages, through waters that could be calm and beautiful one day and rough and challenging the next. The southeastern coast of Australia faces the Tasman Sea, which separates Australia from New Zealand, and the weather systems that sweep across this sea can change rapidly. Melbourne in December 1896 was preparing for the Christmas season, and the city had a festive atmosphere that was somewhat incongruous to Slocum, who was more accustomed to the rhythms of the sea than the celebrations of the calendar. Like Sydney, Melbourne welcomed Slocum enthusiastically. The Victorian government, always eager to promote their city and colony, arranged for official receptions. The Melbourne Harbour Trust provided assistance with berthing and maintenance. Local yacht clubs hosted Slocum at dinners where he was toasted and celebrated. In Melbourne, Slocum gave several public lectures about his voyage. These were more formal affairs than his impromptu talks in Sydney, held in large halls with hundreds of attendees. Tickets were sold, and the proceeds helped to replenish Slocum's finances, which had been depleted by the costs of maintaining and provisioning the Spray. Slocum discovered that he could be entertaining when telling his stories. He had a dry sense of humor and a gift for understated description that made even harrowing experiences seem almost casual. His account of navigating through the Strait of Magellan, where he matter-of-factly described tying tin pans to strings and stretching them around the Spray's deck to deter attacks by the indigenous people, who never actually materialized, had audiences laughing even as they recognized the underlying fear he must have felt. From Melbourne, Slocum continued westward, eventually reaching Adelaide in South Australia. Adelaide was a smaller city than Sydney or Melbourne, but it too had an active maritime community that welcomed Slocum. By now it was January 1897, high summer in the southern hemisphere, and the weather was hot and dry. Slocum spent several weeks in Adelaide, making final preparations for what he knew would be one of the most challenging legs of his entire circumnavigation, the passage across the Great Australian Bight and into the Indian Ocean. The reception Slocum received in Australia was extraordinary. Word of his solo voyage had spread, carried by newspapers and steamship mail, and Australians were fascinated by this American sailor who had undertaken such an audacious adventure. He was invited to give lectures about his voyage, and audiences packed halls to hear him speak. Slocum, who had always been somewhat reserved, found himself thrust into the role of public figure and celebrity. He handled it with characteristic modesty, downplaying the dangers he had faced and emphasizing instead the beauty of the ocean and the joy of sailing. Slocum remained in Australia for several months, from October 1896 through March 1897. He sailed along the Australian coast, visiting multiple ports including Melbourne and Adelaide. In each city, he was welcomed by sailing enthusiasts and maritime communities who recognized the significance of what he was accomplishing. The Spray was hauled out for a thorough inspection and repairs, and Slocum used this time to rest, recover, and prepare for the next leg of his journey. The Australian coast itself presented new challenges. The southern waters around Tasmania could be rough and dangerous, with storms sweeping up from the Antarctic. Slocum had to time his departure carefully, waiting for favorable weather before beginning the next major crossing. He also had to decide on his route. He could sail around the southern coast of Australia and then strike out across the Indian Ocean, or he could take a more northern route through the straits between the Indonesian islands. In the end, he chose the southern route, which would take him across the Great Australian Bight and then into the Indian Ocean proper. The Great Australian Bight, the wide bay that indents the southern coast of Australia, has a reputation among sailors as one of the roughest stretches of water in the world. The Southern Ocean, which encircles Antarctica, sends enormous swells rolling northward, and when these encounter the shallower waters of the Bight, they can build into terrifying waves. Slocum sailed through the Bight in March and April of 1897, experiencing some of the worst weather of his entire circumnavigation. The challenges of the Great Australian Bight begin with its geography. The southern coast of Australia forms a concave arc that curves northward before turning back to the southwest. This shape tends to funnel and concentrate the swells coming up from the Southern Ocean. The continental shelf in this region is relatively narrow, meaning that deep ocean swells transition abruptly to shallower water, where they steepen and become more dangerous. Add to this the weather systems that sweep across the Southern Ocean, storms that circle the globe in the roaring 40s latitude band, unimpeded by any landmass, and you have conditions that can challenge even the most experienced sailors. Slocum departed from Adelaide in late February 1897, timing his departure for what he hoped would be a favorable weather window. The summer months in the Southern Hemisphere, from December through February, offer the best chance of reasonable weather in the Bight, though reasonable is a relative term in these waters. Slocum had studied accounts from other sailors who had made this passage, and he knew what to expect, or at least he thought he did. The first few days west of Adelaide were manageable. The Spray sailed along in moderate winds, with the Australian coast visible to the north. Slocum followed the standard routing for this passage, staying well offshore to avoid the dangers of a lee shore, the nightmare scenario where a boat is driven toward a coast by wind and waves with no room to maneuver away, but not so far offshore that he lost sight of land entirely, which provided valuable points of reference for navigation. But as the Spray progressed westward, the weather began to deteriorate. The barometer, which Slocum checked religiously every few hours, began to fall, a sure sign of approaching low pressure and its associated storms. The swells, which had been running at perhaps 6 to 8 feet, began to build. By the time Slocum reached the central part of the bight, the waves were running at 15 feet or more, with occasional sets that were even larger. The spray's motion in these conditions was violent and exhausting. She would climb each wave face, her bow rising higher and higher until it seemed she might pitchpole, flip end over end. Then at the crest she would hesitate for a moment before plunging down the backside into the trough. At the bottom, the next wave would be waiting, and the cycle would repeat. Water came aboard with every wave, flooding the deck and pouring off the sides through the scuppers. Everything had to be lashed down or it would be swept overboard. Slocum himself had to clip his safety harness to the boat whenever he was on deck, knowing that a moment's inattention could result in being washed over the side. Sleep became almost impossible. The boat's motion was too violent to rest comfortably, and Slocum couldn't leave the Spray to sail herself for extended periods in these conditions. Every wave had to be met at the right angle, or it could knock the boat sideways, possibly causing her to roll or even capsize. Slocum snatched brief periods of rest when he could, sometimes lashing himself to the helm and dozing for a few minutes at a time while his body responded automatically to the boat's motion, his hands adjusting the tiller even in his semi-conscious state. The storm continued for days. In his journal, Slocum recorded wave heights that he estimated at 30 feet or more. The sky was a leaden grey, with low clouds racing overhead and rain squalls that reduced visibility to near zero. The wind howled through the rigging, creating a sound that seemed almost alive, a banshee wail that never let up. The Spray would shudder with each impact as waves broke against her hull, and Slocum could only trust that his reconstruction of the old oyster boat had been thorough enough to withstand this punishment. At night, the conditions became even more terrifying. Slocum couldn't see the waves approaching, could only feel them lifting the Spray and then dropping her. He navigated by instinct and by the feel of the wind on his face, making constant small adjustments to keep the boat at the best angle to the seas. The phosphorescence in the water, microscopic organisms that glow when disturbed, created an eerie light show, with the crests of breaking waves appearing as lines of ghostly green fire in the darkness. The physical toll of the passage through the bight was severe. Slocum was in his 50s, not a young man, and the constant exertion and lack of sleep pushed him to his limits. His hands became raw from gripping the tiller and handling wet ropes. His clothes were constantly soaked with salt water, which chafed his skin. He couldn't cook hot meals in these conditions. The stove, which used alcohol as fuel, was too dangerous to light when the boat was pitching violently. He subsisted on bread, dried fruit, and whatever else he could eat without preparation. But perhaps the greatest challenge was the psychological toll. The relentless violence of the motion, the constant noise of wind and waves, the knowledge that he was hundreds of miles from any possible assistance, all of this wore on Slocum's mental state. He had to constantly fight against despair, against the temptation to think that the storm would never end, that the Spray would eventually be overwhelmed, that he had made a fatal mistake in attempting this voyage. His defense against these dark thoughts was action. He kept himself busy with the endless tasks of sailing and maintaining the boat. He talked to himself, and to the Spray, encouraging both himself and his vessel to keep going, to survive just one more wave, one more hour, one more day. After nearly 2 weeks of these brutal conditions, the weather finally began to moderate. The barometer stopped falling and began a slow rise. The waves, while still large, became more regular and less chaotic. The wind decreased from a screaming gale to a fresh breeze. Slocum, exhausted beyond measure, finally allowed himself to believe that the worst was over. The Spray had survived. He had survived. They had passed through the Great Australian Bight, one of the most feared passages in the world of sailing, and emerged intact on the other side. When Slocum finally cleared the western end of the Great Australian Bight and entered the Indian Ocean proper, the worst was behind him. The Indian Ocean presented its own challenges: tropical cyclones, coral reefs, unpredictable currents, but Slocum was by now a veteran of ocean crossings. He had learned to read the weather, to anticipate problems before they became critical, to manage his resources carefully, and to endure the psychological challenges of extended solitude. The Indian Ocean is the third largest ocean on Earth, covering about 20% of the water on the planet's surface. It stretches from the coast of Africa in the west to Australia and Indonesia in the east, from Asia in the north to the Southern Ocean in the south. Unlike the Atlantic and Pacific, which are bounded primarily by the Americas and Asia, the Indian Ocean is bounded by Africa, Asia, and Australia, giving it a unique character. The weather patterns, the currents, and even the color of the water all differed from what Slocum had experienced in his previous ocean crossings. One of the most significant features of the Indian Ocean is the monsoon system. For half the year, from roughly November through March, the winds blow from the northeast, bringing dry weather to the northern Indian Ocean and wet weather to the southern regions. Then, from April through October, the winds reverse, blowing from the southwest and bringing the opposite pattern. Slocum was making his Indian Ocean crossing in April and May, right at the transition period between monsoons, which meant the winds could be variable and unpredictable. His route across the Indian Ocean took him northwest toward the Cocos Keeling Islands, a remote group of coral atolls about halfway between Australia and Sri Lanka. These islands were barely inhabited, home to only a small community of coconut plantation workers and their families. Slocum arrived in April 1897 and was welcomed by the island's owner, who was fascinated by this solo sailor who had appeared from nowhere. The visit to the Cocos Islands provided a brief respite, a chance to rest and replenish water supplies before continuing westward. The Cocos Islands sit almost exactly on the equator, and Slocum's arrival there marked his crossing from the southern hemisphere back into the northern hemisphere for the first time since leaving the Strait of Magellan. The islands themselves were tiny specks of land in a vast ocean, low-lying coral formations that rose only a few feet above sea level. They were covered with coconut palms, and the lagoons within the atolls were so clear that Slocum could see the bottom even in water 20 or 30 feet deep. Fish of every imaginable color swam in these lagoons, brilliant blues, yellows, reds, and greens that seemed almost artificial in their intensity. The few inhabitants of the Cocos Islands lived a life that was isolated even by the standards of the 19th century. Ships called there only occasionally, and the community was largely self-sufficient, living on coconuts, fish, and whatever else they could grow or catch. They were curious about Slocum and his voyage, and he spent several days there, sharing meals with the islanders and telling them about the places he had visited. In return, they shared their knowledge of the local waters, warning him about currents and reefs that might pose dangers as he continued westward. From the Cocos Islands, Slocum sailed on to Mauritius, the beautiful island in the western Indian Ocean that had once been an important waypoint for ships sailing between Europe and Asia. Mauritius was a French colony when Slocum arrived, though Britain had also controlled it at various times. The island had a complex mix of cultures, French, British, Indian, African, all living together in a tropical paradise. Slocum spent about 2 weeks there, enjoying the hospitality of the local sailing community and preparing the spray for the next major crossing. Mauritius in May 1897 was a prosperous island, its economy based primarily on sugar cane cultivation. The island's ports were busy with ships loading sugar for export to Europe, and the capital, Port Louis, was a cosmopolitan city that reflected the island's multicultural heritage. Slocum found the climate pleasant, warm but not oppressively hot, with trade winds that kept the air moving and comfortable. The island itself was mountainous, with peaks rising to over 2,500 feet, and covered with lush tropical vegetation. During his stay in Mauritius, Slocum took the opportunity to explore beyond the port areas. He visited sugar plantations where workers, many of them descendants of Indian labourers brought to the island in the 19th century, cut cane by hand under the tropical sun. He hiked into the mountains where waterfalls cascaded down jungle-covered slopes. He visited the island's botanical gardens, which contained specimens from around the world, including some from his native North America. These brief excursions on land provided a welcome break from the constant motion of life aboard the Spray. The maritime community in Mauritius was particularly welcoming. The island's strategic location in the Indian Ocean meant that it had a long tradition of seafaring, and local sailors understood the significance of Slocum's voyage. They helped him with repairs to the Spray, shared information about weather patterns and currents for the upcoming passage to South Africa, and provided provisions at reasonable prices. Several local sailors invited Slocum to their homes, where he enjoyed meals that were a delicious blend of French, Indian, and Creole cuisines. The route from Mauritius to South Africa took Slocum across almost 2,000 miles of open ocean. This was familiar sailing now, steady winds, regular routines, days blending into one another in the timeless rhythm of ocean passage. The Indian Ocean in May and June was relatively calm, and the Spray made good time. Slocum used these quiet days to catch up on his writing, recording detailed accounts of his experiences that would later form the basis of his book. The passage to South Africa also gave Slocum time to reflect on how far he had come, both literally and figuratively. He had now sailed more than 3/4 of the way around the world. He had crossed the Atlantic, navigated the treacherous Strait of Magellan, sailed across the vast Pacific, survived the Southern Ocean swells in the Great Australian Bight, and now was crossing the Indian Ocean. One more ocean, the Atlantic again, and he would complete his circumnavigation. The realization that success was now within reach must have been both exhilarating and slightly anticlimactic. After so many months of facing the unknown, the end was in sight. But Slocum was not the type of person to count his chickens before they hatched. He knew that the ocean could be treacherous until the very last mile, that complacency could be fatal. He maintained his vigilance, his regular routine of navigation and boat maintenance, his careful management of provisions and water. The Spray, for her part, continued to perform admirably. She had now carried Slocum safely across thousands upon thousands of miles of ocean, through storms and calms, across tropical and temperate waters, and she showed no signs of failing. When the coast of South Africa appeared on the horizon in June 1897, Slocum had completed over 2/3 of his circumnavigation. He sailed around the Cape of Good Hope, the southwestern tip of Africa, another of the world's great maritime landmarks. The Cape has a fearsome reputation, with storms that can blow up with little warning and seas that can overwhelm even large ships. But Slocum had timed his passage carefully, waiting for favorable weather, and he rounded the Cape without significant difficulty. The Cape of Good Hope, despite its ominous reputation, treated Slocum relatively kindly. He experienced some strong winds and rough seas as he rounded the Cape, but nothing comparable to what he had endured in the Great Australian Bight. The Cape's reputation comes from the fact that it marks the meeting point of two oceans, the Atlantic and the Indian, and two current systems. The warmer Gulhas current flows southward along the east coast of Africa, and when it meets the cold Bengala current that flows northward along the west coast, the result can be violent and unpredictable seas. Ships have been lost here for centuries, overwhelmed by waves that can build to enormous heights when wind opposes current. But on the day Slocum rounded the Cape, the conditions were manageable. He took his sextant sightings carefully, calculating his position with precision to ensure he gave the Cape and its associated hazards a wide berth. He watched the water carefully, noting the change in color and texture as he moved from one current system to another. And he felt a sense of accomplishment as he passed this famous landmark, one more milestone on his journey around the world. From the Cape of Good Hope, Slocum sailed northward along the west coast of Africa. He stopped at several ports, including Cape Town, where he was again welcomed by local sailors and given assistance with repairs and provisions. The sailing community in Cape Town was particularly active, and many sailors there understood exactly what Slocum had accomplished and what he still had to do. Cape Town in July 1897 was a bustling colonial city, the capital of the British Cape Colony and a major port for ships traveling between Europe and Asia. The city sat at the foot of Table Mountain, a distinctive flat-topped peak that served as a landmark for sailors approaching from the sea. Cape Town's harbour was always busy with ships of all types: British warships maintaining the Empire's presence in southern Africa, merchant vessels loading and unloading cargo, coastal traders, and smaller craft serving the local fishing industry. Slocum's arrival in Cape Town marked an important milestone. He was now beginning the final leg of his circumnavigation. From here, he would sail northward up the west coast of Africa, then across the Atlantic back to America. If all went well, he would complete his journey around the world within a few months. The prospect of success, after more than 2 years of sailing, must have been both exciting and somewhat daunting. Success was within reach, but there was still much that could go wrong. The maritime community in Cape Town had been following Slocum's progress through newspaper reports and letters that had arrived on steamships from Australia and the Indian Ocean ports. When word spread that the famous solo sailor had arrived, Slocum found himself once again thrust into the role of minor celebrity. The Royal Cape Yacht Club invited him to speak at their clubhouse, where he recounted his experiences to an audience of sailors who could appreciate the technical challenges he had overcome. Local newspapers sent reporters to interview him, and their articles generated even more interest among the general public. During his stay in Cape Town, Slocum also had the opportunity to meet with British naval officers stationed at the port. The Royal Navy maintained a significant presence in Cape Town, and several officers who were themselves experienced sailors wanted to examine the Spray and discuss navigation and seamanship with Slocum. These conversations were valuable for Slocum. The naval officers had access to the latest charts and weather information, and they shared their knowledge of currents and winds in the South Atlantic, information that would help Slocum plan his route home. The Spray underwent another thorough inspection in Cape Town. She had now been at sea for over 2 years, with only brief periods in port for maintenance. The harsh conditions in the Great Australian Bight had taken their toll, and there were numerous small repairs that needed to be made. The rigging was inspected and several lines were replaced. The sails were examined for wear and repaired where necessary. The hull was checked again, and while it remained sound, additional caulking was applied in several places where minor leaks had developed. Slocum also took the opportunity to completely reorganize his provisions, discarding anything that had spoiled or deteriorated and restocking with fresh supplies for the Atlantic crossing. One of the challenges Slocum faced in Cape Town was financial. His voyage was not sponsored. He was funding it entirely from his own limited resources and whatever he could earn along the way. The lectures he had given in Australia had provided some income, but the costs of maintaining and provisioning the Spray were ongoing. In Cape Town, Slocum arranged to write several articles about his voyage for newspapers and magazines, selling the rights to publish his accounts in exchange for payment that helped to cover his expenses. This financial pressure would remain a constant concern throughout the voyage and would influence his decisions about where to stop and how long to stay in each port. The passage from Cape Town northward along the west coast of Africa took Slocum through waters that had witnessed centuries of European exploration and colonization. This was the coast that Portuguese navigators had explored in the 15th century, pushing southward in their quest to find a sea route to Asia. Bartholomew Diaz had rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, proving that Africa had a southern limit and that it was possible to sail from Europe to the Indian Ocean. Vasco da Gama had followed a few years later, becoming the first European to reach India by sea. Slocum, sailing these same waters for centuries later, was following in the wake of these great navigators, but doing so alone in a small boat that would have seemed impossibly tiny to the captains of those earlier expeditions. The west coast of Africa presented its own navigation challenges. The Bengala Current flows northward along this coast, carrying cold water up from the Antarctic. Where this cold current meets the warm air over the land, it creates fog that can reduce visibility to near zero. Slocum had to navigate carefully, using his compass and his dead reckoning skills when he couldn't see landmarks or take celestial sightings. The coast itself was largely inhospitable, long stretches of desert or arid land with few natural harbors and even fewer settlements. Slocum made several stops along the African coast as he worked his way northward. Each stop provided an opportunity to replenish water, which was always a concern in these latitudes where rain was infrequent. He also took on fresh food when available, fruit, vegetables, and occasionally fresh meat or fish, luxuries that broke the monotony of his preserved rations. At each stop, he would check over the spray, making small repairs and adjustments that kept the boat in good sailing condition. The passage up the west coast of Africa and then across the Atlantic back to America would be the final leg of Slocum's circumnavigation. He left South Africa in July 1897 and sailed northward into the South Atlantic. His planned route would take him past St. Helena, the remote island where Napoleon had been exiled, and then across to South America before turning northward toward the Caribbean and ultimately back to the United States. St. Helena sits in the middle of the South Atlantic, a volcanic island that rises dramatically from the ocean. It was one of the most isolated inhabited places on Earth, its only regular connection to the outside world being the mail steamers that called there every few weeks. Slocum anchored off the island in August 1897 and went ashore to visit the places associated with Napoleon's exile. He climbed to Longwood House, where the fallen emperor had lived out his final years, and stood in the garden looking out over the same ocean that had both enabled Napoleon's rise and ensured his imprisonment. St. Helena was a British colony, and the small population of the island, perhaps 4,000 people in 1897, lived a life that was isolated even by Victorian standards. Ships called rarely, and news from the outside world arrived weeks or months after the events it described. The islanders were curious about Slocum and his solo voyage, and he spent several days there, sharing meals with local families and telling them about the places he had visited. The contrast between his mobile existence, having visited dozens of ports across 3 oceans, and their settled life on this remote island must have been striking to both sides. The island's most famous resident, Napoleon, had died in 1821, over 70 years before Slocum's visit, but his presence still dominated the island's identity. The house where he had lived was maintained as a kind of museum, and the garden where he had walked was kept in good order. His original grave on the island had been marked by a simple stone. His body had been returned to France in 1840, and visitors still came to pay their respects. Slocum, standing at this grave, must have reflected on the strange turns of fortune that bring people to remote places, Napoleon by force, himself by choice, each following the currents of history and circumstance. From St. Helena, Slocum sailed westward across the Atlantic toward South America. This was familiar territory now. He had crossed the Atlantic from east to west before, when he had sailed from Gibraltar to South America on his way to the Strait of Magellan. But this time was different. This time he was completing a circumnavigation, coming full circle around the entire globe. The realization of what he was accomplishing must have begun to sink in during those days at sea. The Atlantic crossing from St. Helena to South America took several weeks. The trade winds were favorable, pushing the spray steadily westward, and Slocum fell back into the routines that had become second nature over more than 2 years at sea. He took his celestial sightings each day, calculating his position and updating his charts. He adjusted sails to maximize the spray's speed while ensuring she remained balanced and could steer herself. He cooked his meals, maintained his gear, wrote in his journal, and read from the small library of books he had carried around the world. The solitude of these weeks was profound, but it was a familiar solitude now. Slocum had learned to live with his own thoughts, to find contentment in the simple rhythms of ocean sailing. The endless expanse of water, which might have been oppressive at the beginning of his voyage, had become almost comforting. Out here, far from land, the world was reduced to its essentials: wind, water, sky, and one small boat carrying one man across it all. He reached the coast of South America in September 1897 and then sailed northward through the Caribbean, stopping at several islands including Grenada, Antigua, and finally arriving at the island of Tortola in the British Virgin Islands. By now, Slocum had been at sea for over 2.5 years. He had sailed roughly 40,000 miles, visited dozens of ports, crossed 3 oceans, and accomplished what no one else had ever done: sailed around the world completely alone. The Caribbean islands in September were recovering from the hurricane season, which peaks in August and September. Slocum had to be careful to avoid any late-season storms, but the weather was generally favorable. The islands themselves were beautiful, lush tropical vegetation, clear blue waters, and a pleasant climate that made a welcome change from the cold and storms of the Southern Ocean. The people of the Caribbean islands were accustomed to seeing sailors. The Caribbean had been a crossroads of maritime trade for centuries, but even here, word of Slocum's solo circumnavigation had spread, and he was welcomed enthusiastically at each stop. The final leg from the Caribbean back to the United States was almost anticlimactic after everything that had come before. Slocum sailed northward through the Bahamas and along the east coast of Florida, Georgia, and the Carolinas. He was heading not for Boston, where he had started, but for Newport, Rhode Island, where he had friends and where he knew he would find a suitable place to end his voyage. The waters off the eastern United States were busy with commercial traffic, steamships plying regular routes between American ports, coastal schooners carrying cargo, fishing vessels, and even a few pleasure yachts. After the empty expanses of the Pacific and Indian Oceans, the crowded waters felt almost claustrophobic. Slocum had to be constantly alert for other vessels, particularly at night when a collision with a steamer could sink the spray in seconds. On June 27, 1898, 3 years, 1 month, and 3 days after leaving Boston, Joshua Slocum sailed the Spray into Newport Harbor. He had completed the first solo circumnavigation of the globe. Word of his arrival spread quickly, and a crowd gathered at the waterfront to greet him. Reporters wanted interviews, sailors wanted to examine the Spray, and everyone wanted to hear the story of this remarkable journey. Slocum had kept detailed journals throughout his voyage, and these would form the basis of his book, Sailing Alone Around the World, published in 1900. The book was an immediate success, praised for its clear, unpretentious prose and its vivid descriptions of ocean sailing and distant lands. It has remained in print continuously since its first publication and is considered one of the greatest sailing narratives ever written. Slocum's matter-of-fact style, his ability to convey both the beauty and the terror of the sea, and his obvious love of sailing all shine through in every page. The writing of the book itself was a process that took Slocum nearly 2 years. He worked from his extensive journals, which he had maintained throughout the voyage, recording daily positions, weather conditions, and observations. But the book was more than just a log of the voyage, it was a literary work that captured the experience of solo ocean sailing in prose that was accessible to both sailors and landlubbers. Slocum had a gift for description that brought the places he visited to life on the page, and he had a dry sense of humor that made even dangerous situations seem manageable in retrospect. Sailing Alone Around the World was published by the Century Company in 1900, 2 years after Slocum's return. It had been serialized in Century magazine before book publication, which helped to build an audience for the full work. The book was well received by critics, who praised its authenticity and its unpretentious style. One reviewer noted that Slocum wrote with the ease of a practiced raconteur and the precision of an experienced navigator, capturing exactly the dual nature of the work, part adventure story, part technical sailing narrative. The book's success provided Slocum with much-needed income. He had returned from his circumnavigation with very little money. The voyage had consumed whatever resources he had accumulated from his earlier life as a commercial sea captain. The royalties from the book, combined with fees from magazine articles and lectures, gave him financial stability for the first time in years. But perhaps more importantly, the book established his reputation as a writer as well as a sailor. He would go on to write numerous articles about sailing and maritime subjects, all marked by the same clear prose and keen observation that characterized his book. The structure of Sailing Alone Around the World follows the chronological progress of the voyage, beginning with Slocum's decision to rebuild the Spray and ending with his return to Newport. But it's not just a simple recitation of events. Slocum weaves in historical context about the places he visited, technical explanations of navigation and seamanship for interested readers, and personal reflections on the experience of solitude and the meaning of his journey. The book works on multiple levels, as an adventure story for general readers, as a practical guide for sailors, and as a philosophical meditation on freedom and self-reliance. One of the most remarkable aspects of the book is Slocum's honesty about both the triumphs and the challenges of his voyage. He doesn't present himself as a superhuman figure who easily overcame every obstacle. Instead, he writes openly about his fears, his exhaustion, his loneliness, and the times when he questioned whether he would succeed. This vulnerability makes the book more compelling and more relatable than if he had simply presented a triumphalist account of his achievement. The book also reveals Slocum's deep knowledge of maritime history and literature. Throughout the narrative, he references other sailors and explorers who had passed through the same waters, from Magellan and Drake to Cook and Darwin. He quotes from other sailing narratives, particularly Dana's 2 Years Before the Mast and Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. These references situate his own voyage within the larger tradition of maritime exploration and sailing literature, showing that while his solo circumnavigation was unprecedented, he was part of a long line of sailors who had ventured into distant waters. But what made Slocum's achievement truly extraordinary wasn't just that he had sailed around the world alone, though that in itself was remarkable, but how he had done it. He had navigated without modern technology, relying on a sextant, dead reckoning, and his own extensive experience. He had managed all aspects of sailing, maintaining, and provisioning the Spray entirely by himself, with no crew to help with the endless round of tasks required to keep a boat at sea. He had endured extended periods of complete solitude, weeks at a time when he saw no other human being, and he had done so not as a young man seeking adventure, but as a middle-aged mariner who simply loved sailing. His navigation methods deserve special mention. In an era when accurate timepieces were essential for calculating longitude, the east-west position, Slocum sailed without a chronometer for much of his voyage. The chronometer he had at the start had stopped working early in the voyage, and he relied instead on a tin clock that he had bought for $1. This clock was notoriously inaccurate, and Slocum had to use alternative methods to determine his longitude. He used lunar distance observations when he could, a technique that involved measuring the angle between the moon and specific stars and using complex calculations to determine time and hence longitude. He also relied heavily on dead reckoning, carefully tracking his course and speed and adjusting his calculations based on observed positions when he made landfall. This navigation by imperfect means is actually one of the most impressive aspects of Slocum's voyage. Modern GPS systems can pinpoint a position anywhere on Earth to within a few meters. Even basic electronic navigation equipment can provide accurate positions updated every second. But Slocum was working with 19th century technology, and not even the best of it. He was using improvised methods with imperfect tools, and yet he successfully navigated around the entire world, making landfall at dozens of islands and ports without ever getting seriously lost or running onto reefs or rocks. This demonstrates not just technical skill but an intuitive understanding of the ocean, weather patterns, and navigation that can only come from decades of experience. The Spray herself became famous after the voyage. She was not a purpose-built yacht designed by a naval architect and constructed in a modern boatyard. She was an old oyster boat that Slocum had rebuilt himself, using traditional materials and methods. Her design was based on principles that went back centuries: a full keel for stability, a gaff rig for easy handling, and robust construction that could withstand the punishment of ocean sailing. The fact that such a simple, old-fashioned boat could carry a man safely around the world demonstrated that elaborate equipment and modern technology, while useful, were not essential for ocean voyaging. After his circumnavigation, Slocum continued to sail the Spray. He made several coastal voyages along the eastern seaboard of the United States and visited the West Indies multiple times. He earned money from his book, from magazine articles about his voyage, and from giving lectures. But sailing remained his first love, and he was happiest when aboard the Spray with the wind filling her sails and the open ocean ahead. The question of what happened to Joshua Slocum remains one of sailing's enduring mysteries. In November 1909, at age 65, he set sail from Martha's Vineyard aboard the Spray, heading south toward the Caribbean and possibly on to South America. He was never seen again. Neither he nor the Spray was ever found, despite searches and inquiries. The most likely explanation is that the Spray was run down by a steamer at night. The ocean was increasingly crowded with steamship traffic by 1909, and a small sailing vessel like the Spray would have been difficult to see in darkness. One moment of inattention on the part of a steamer's watch officer, and the Spray could have been struck and sunk so quickly that Slocum had no time to send any signal or launch any alarm. Other theories have been proposed over the years. Some suggest that Slocum might have been overcome by illness or injury and drifted helplessly until the Spray eventually sank. Others speculate that he might have encountered a severe storm that overwhelmed even his considerable seamanship. A few romantics prefer to imagine that he somehow survived and chose to disappear, living out his remaining years in some remote Caribbean island or South American coastal village. But the truth is that we will never know what happened during those final days and hours aboard the Spray. What we do know is that Joshua Slocum's legacy extends far beyond his own lifetime. He inspired generations of sailors to undertake their own ocean voyages. In the decades after his circumnavigation, other sailors followed his example, sailing solo around the world and proving that what Slocum had done was repeatable. Sir Francis Chichester circumnavigated solo in 1966–67, taking roughly the same route as Slocum but in a larger, more modern yacht. Robin Knox Johnston became the first person to sail solo around the world non-stop in 1968–69. Countless others have followed, each adding their own chapter to the story that Slocum began. The Spray, too, has inspired countless imitations. Naval architects have analyzed her design, and several Spray replicas have been built over the years, attempting to recreate Slocum's famous boat. Some of these replicas have themselves undertaken long ocean voyages, testing Slocum's design principles against modern alternatives. While opinions vary on whether the Spray's design is optimal by contemporary standards, there is no question that she was a successful ocean cruising boat for her era. Slocum's book, Sailing Alone Around the World, continues to be read by sailors and adventure enthusiasts around the world. Its influence on sailing literature cannot be overstated. Before Slocum, most sailing narratives were formal, technical accounts written by professional mariners describing commercial or naval voyages. Slocum's book was different, personal, humorous at times, philosophical at others, and always focused on the simple joy of sailing. He wrote about navigational challenges and storms, but he also wrote about the beauty of a sunset at sea, the satisfaction of catching fish for dinner, and the peace that comes from being alone with the ocean. The values that Slocum embodied, self-reliance, courage, simplicity, and a deep connection with the natural world, resonate with people even today, in an age of GPS navigation, satellite communication, and motor-powered yachts equipped with every modern convenience. There is something fundamentally appealing about the idea of one person, one boat, and the open ocean, with no intermediary technology or support system. Slocum proved that a human being, properly prepared and sufficiently determined, could accomplish extraordinary things with modest means. In the years since Slocum's voyage, Technology has transformed ocean sailing in ways he could hardly have imagined. Modern sailboats can communicate instantly with the rest of the world via satellite. They have engines that can propel them when the wind dies. They have electronic navigation systems that can pinpoint their position to within a few feet anywhere on Earth. Weather forecasting has become so accurate that sailors can avoid storms rather than having to endure them. In many ways, modern ocean sailing is safer and easier than it was in Slocum's time. And yet, the fundamental challenge remains the same. The ocean is still vast, still powerful, still capable of overwhelming human efforts. A sailor alone at sea still faces the same psychological challenges of extended solitude. A small boat in a large ocean is still vulnerable to the forces of nature. The romance and the reality of ocean sailing continue to attract people who want to test themselves against one of Earth's last great wildernesses. Joshua Slocum represents a particular moment in maritime history, the transition from the age of commercial sail to the age of recreational sailing. In his youth, sailing ships were still the primary means of long-distance ocean transportation. Steamships existed but were not yet dominant. By the time he completed his circumnavigation, steamships had largely replaced sailing vessels for commercial purposes. But Slocum demonstrated that sailing had a future beyond commerce. Sailing for its own sake, for the joy and challenge of it, would become the preserve of individuals like himself who loved the activity regardless of its economic utility. The maritime establishment of Slocum's era was initially skeptical of his achievement. Professional sailors, accustomed to large ships with full crews, found it difficult to believe that one man could manage a boat single-handed across all the world's oceans. Some questioned whether he had really completed the voyage as claimed. But the evidence was overwhelming. The spray had been seen at ports all around the world. Slocum's detailed descriptions of places he had visited were accurate, and his navigation calculations, when checked, proved to be remarkably precise. Eventually, even the skeptics had to acknowledge that Joshua Slocum had indeed accomplished what he claimed. Today, Slocum is remembered as one of the greatest sailors in maritime history. He is mentioned in the same breath as other legendary mariners, Ferdinand Magellan, who first circumnavigated the globe, though he died before completing the voyage, Captain James Cook, who explored the Pacific with scientific precision, and Sir Ernest Shackleton, who survived against impossible odds in Antarctic waters. But Slocum is unique among these legends because he was not sailing for any nation, not exploring for any sponsor, not seeking to establish any commercial advantage. He was simply a man who loved sailing and wanted to prove that it could be done. The story of Joshua Slocum and the Spray reminds us that adventure is not just for the young, that extraordinary achievements don't require extraordinary resources, and that the human spirit, properly directed, is capable of remarkable things. Slocum was 51 years old when he departed Boston, an age when many people are thinking about retirement, not embarking on the adventure of a lifetime. He had no wealthy sponsors, no support team, no modern technology. He had only his skill, his experience, his determination, and the spray. When we look back at Slocum's voyage from the perspective of the 21st century, we might be tempted to view it as a relic of a simpler time, an achievement that no longer resonates in our modern, connected world. But that would be a mistake. The challenges Slocum faced, fear, loneliness, physical danger, the temptation to give up when things got difficult, are timeless human experiences. His responses to those challenges, courage, persistence, resourcefulness, and a sense of humor about his own situation, are qualities that remain admirable regardless of the era. The ocean has not changed since Slocum's time. It is still beautiful and terrible, serene and violent, life-giving and deadly. To sail across it alone remains one of the great human challenges, a test of skill, courage, and determination that few will ever attempt and fewer still will complete successfully. Joshua Slocum was the first to pass that test, and in doing so, he set a standard that continues to inspire sailors more than a century later. If you're finding yourself drifting off to the rhythm of the waves that carried Joshua Slocum around the world, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories of exploration, adventure, and the remarkable individuals who pushed the boundaries of what was thought possible. The spray may have disappeared beneath the waves somewhere in the Atlantic over a century ago, but the spirit of adventure that drove Joshua Slocum forward continues to sail on, inspiring new generations to seek their own horizons, to test their own limits, and to discover what lies beyond the familiar shores of home. Fair winds and following seas to all who dare to venture into the unknown.